Pontiff. Danitz jumped in fright, nearly unable to believe the revelation he had received. If it wasn't for the fact that this order directly came from Mr. Fool, he would have definitely cursed. Of course, if the person opposite him was Gairman Sparrow, he would suck it up. Lord Oracle, is there anything else? The intel supervisor of the Church of the Sea God saw that Lord Danitz's expression was rather odd. This left him a little afraid. Danitz retracted his thoughts and forced a smile. Pay close attention to the development at the Cathedral of Waves. Yes, Lord Oracle. The intel supervisor heaved a sigh of relief and hurriedly bowed to bid farewell. Danitz turned his head and looked at Alger Wilson as he said with a brilliant smile, Mr. Fool has already issued a revelation. Alger didn't hesitate. He immediately stood up and pressed his right palm against his left chest. Danitz straightened his back and solemnly said, God said that from this day forth, Alger shall wear a mask and become the pontiff of the Church of the Sea God. Mr. Fool's will is my will. Alger couldn't hide his smile as he bowed. Half of his smile was for Danitz to see, showing his humility, while the other half was from the bottom of his heart. This was because the revelation meant two things: Mr. Fool and the Lord of Storms had reached a certain agreement. With a tacit understanding, his betrayal would no longer be pursued. Of course, he had to wear masks and use a fake name to prevent humiliation to the Church of Storms. Becoming the pontiff of the Church of the Sea God was a critical step to reaching the throne of Sea God. From Alger's point of view, this meant that he had officially become Mr. Fool's subordinate. In the future, be it the exchange for the identity of Sea God or being the leader of the Church of the Fool, there would be plenty of opportunities. As for Mr. Fool, he was a great existence that was at the same level as a true god, or even higher. How could his proxy not be an angel? After the bow, Alger waited patiently for Oracle Danitz to bring him a silver-black mask. He received the mask and wore it solemnly. While wearing a red glove, Leonard strolled along the shores of Midseashire, enjoying the Rue 0026R earned from closing a supernatural case. As for the mysterious opening of doors and windows last night, he had already received the orders from the Holy Cathedral not to pursue it through investigations or learn more about the matter. Regarding this order, Leonard couldn't do anything about it because he had long learned the general truth from Old Man Palais Zoroast. Mr. Dor had returned to the real world, and Angel of Time Amon took the opportunity to steal his apotheosis ritual and advance to sequence 0 error. Almost at the same time, Mr. Fool awakened further. Through Sephira Castle, he had briefly and weakly connected to Beyonders of the Seer, Apprentice, and Marauder pathways. As an angel of the Marauder pathway, Palais Zoroast was undoubtedly able to sense the changes in Amon's corresponding authority and his apotheosis. He also discovered that Sephira Castle had established a connection with him. Old man, Amon has already advanced to sequence 0. You shouldn't be of much use to him now. Why do you still want to parasitize my body? Leonard took in the fresh morning air as he suppressed his voice and asked with a hint of concern and confusion. In his mind, Palais Zoroast scoffed. Naive. Do you think that you don't need my guidance anymore after becoming a saint and having mastered a lot of mysticism knowledge? You can choose to teach me face to face, Leonard said after some deliberation. To him, having an angel parasitizing his body was both a boon and bane for him. The good thing was that even if he encountered a real mythical creature, he wouldn't be completely defenseless. As long as he softly shouted, "Old man," the problem might be resolved. In addition, history and various rare mysticism knowledge from the Fourth Epoch were also rather useful. The greatest disadvantage was that his life was in the hands of the parasite. If the other party had any evil intentions, he couldn't stop it. This question was once Leonard's greatest worry, but it wasn't too problematic now. This was because Mr. Fool's awakening was deepening, allowing him to completely suppress Palais Zoroast. Furthermore, Leonard had also become a high-ranking deacon of the Church of Evernite. He would definitely be under the watch of the Evernite goddess, and he could even be specially marked by her. Under such circumstances, it was impossible for a deity with the concealment authority to not discover Palais Zoroast. If Old Man had any nefarious thoughts, he would have been resolved long ago. What Leonard was most vexed about was that many things weren't too convenient as a result. Although he was already used to having an old man parasitizing his body, and he would even casually chat with him while on the toilet, he still preferred having that time to himself in such situations. Therefore, he felt that having old man leave his body, and letting him live in his house like an elder would be a better way of getting along with him. When he needed to deal with more dangerous matters, he could get Old Man to temporarily parasitize him. Upon hearing Leonard's suggestion, Palais Zoroast scoffed. Are you still thinking about removing the parasitizing when you return home, and parasitize when out? Do you think I'm your bodyguard? Leonard laughed dryly before saying, if you haven't fully recovered and wish to continue parasitizing, I have no objections. Palais Zoroast fell silent for 2 seconds before his slightly aged voice resounded in Leonard's mind. Next up is actually the most dangerous period. For the position of the Lord of the Mysteries, the Fool and Aemon will definitely have a battle. When the time comes, under the influence of all kinds of Beyonder characteristics, angels of the same pathway might be affected. Hey, it's better to be kept under the protection of Evernight's gaze. When the Lord of the Mysteries is born, I won't even bother with you even if you were to beg me to be parasitized. Leonard was slightly taken aback as he subconsciously repeated the name. Lord of the Mysteries. This isn't something you can fully understand. Of course, with me around, there's no need to worry, Palais Zoroast sighed and said with pride. Leonard was just about to take the opportunity to ask when he suddenly saw a Red Gloves team member running over with a telegram. Reverend, a telegram from the Holy Cathedral, the team member said respectfully. Leonard nodded slightly and received the telegram. He quickly scanned it. Head to the southern continent and participate in the besieging of the Rose School of Thought. Southern continent. Rose School of Thought. Leonard narrowed down to 2 keywords. He quickly returned to the largest cathedral in this city and used large-scale ritualistic magic to establish a connection with the Holy Cathedral. In his dream, he met the Pope, Ma Mariana, and other high-ranking officials. After a simple exchange, Leonard roughly understood the essence of the mission. The various Orthodox churches would delegate 3 to 4 demigods to head to the southern continent to besiege the Rose School of Thought, which had become very active after the World War. This was a long-term mission. As the Rose School of Thought's demigods knew how to hide their tracks, they did things in a rather secretive manner. They weren't easy to locate or lock onto. It wasn't easy to deal with them either. According to what the Pope had said, it was already considered quite good to see enough results within 3 years. During this process, the Holy Cathedral would observe the situation and rotate demigods to ensure that the archbishops and high-ranking deacons were in a relatively stable mental state. After leaving the dream, Leonard looked around and suppressed his voice. Old man, things are a little strange. Why would the various churches suddenly target the Rose School of Thought? This wasn't an easy task. In the past few centuries, it wasn't as if the Orthodox churches hadn't made similar attempts, but they could only suppress and weaken them, without being capable of eradicating the Rose School of Thought. On the one hand, it was because there were cracks in their alliances. There was suspicion among each other and a lack of cooperation. On the other hand, due to the Rose School of Thought's demigods' indulgence, their mental states might be abnormal, but when faced with danger, they knew how to avoid, hide, and conceal. They wouldn't throw themselves into danger for no reason. In addition, with the blessings of the Chained God and the Mother Tree of Desire, it was difficult for the deities to provide precise guidance for their actions. Palais Zoroast didn't immediately answer Leonard's question. After about 10 seconds, he sighed and said with a slightly aged voice, "This is to eliminate potential threats, and to prepare for the apocalypse." Prepare for the apocalypse. Leonard turned agape and wanted to say something, but he eventually fell silent. Backland, Harvest Church. Emlyn White had just entered the hall, but before he could head to his room and change his clothes, he saw Father Utreski stand up in the front pew, like a mountain rising from the ground. Earth Mother has instructed us to head to the southern continent and bury the evildoers. The Blessed spoke in a low voice. His voice reverberated in the hall, like a slow clap of thunder, causing the praying sanguine believers to open their eyes. So the dream last night was real. Emlyn was enlightened. Last night, he dreamed of the ancestor, and he dreamed that she wanted him to work with Father Utreski and the Rose School of Thought's temperance faction to head to the southern continent to deal with the Rose School of Thought members who believed in the primordial moon. Of course, if there was a chance, the enemies who believed in the Mother Tree of Desire would not be spared. As he often had fake revelations, Emlyn didn't take this dream to heart. He planned on changing his clothes and completing his prayers before seeking confirmation with Father Utreski. He tersely acknowledged before replying to Father Utreski in a rather composed manner. "There's no rush. I'll first contact the members of the Rose School of Thought's temperance faction." Father Utreski nodded nonchalantly and said, "Select some volunteer sanguine too." Ellipsis. In the Intis Republic, in the capital, Trier, a supervisor of an intelligence agency was assigning tasks to his subordinates. Suddenly, his vision blurred as he heard a distant voice ring in his ears. Orville, Dillon, Orville, Dillon. As a Beyonder who joined the Intis Public Security Bureau as a member of the Secret Order, it wasn't the first time that Antoine encountered something like that. In the past, whenever he advanced, he would hear, Hornachus. Phlegrea, Hornachus, Phlegrea. He nearly lost control of himself several times. Unlike before, the content of the whispers seemed to have changed. After the ravings died down, everything in front of him returned to normal. Antoine frowned and muttered to himself, "My mental state has been very stable recently, and I haven't consumed the potion or attempted to advance. Why would I hear the whispers of a secret existence? This doesn't seem to be the same as before. What does Orville mean? I lack enough information. I can't understand it at all." Dillon, yes, the brass of the Order have mentioned that our mysterious and terrifying leader once hid an ancient castle called Dillon. TSK, once I recall that existence, I can't help but shiver. Although he has returned to normal in the past 2 years, the terrifying legends and physical destruction that he left behind is enough to give people a lifetime of nightmares. Antoine calmed himself down and suppressed his puzzlement. He continued to assign missions to his subordinates. In front of a tombstone, Klein, who had just put down the white flowers, turned his head slightly, as though he was listening to something. Although he didn't hear anything, as a king of angels who wielded control over a portion of his pathway's authority, he could acutely sense that something was amiss. Some secret information was being transmitted to specific targets. Zaratul isn't completely dead yet. Klein retracted his gaze and muttered to himself. Back then, he had relied on his level, status, and authority to forcefully stop Zaratul's resurrection. He didn't sense anything abnormal, but after studying himself, he realized something problematic. The Beyonder characteristic he had absorbed from Zaratul was one that contained an entire set of sequence 9 to 1 Beyonder characteristics. That also meant that this only included a single miracle invoker Beyonder characteristic. And Snake of Fate Will Orsepton had mentioned that Zaratul and the ancestor of the Antigonus family had both taken an additional miracle invoker Beyonder characteristic in them. Therefore, the reality of the situation was that there was no doubt that there was an additional miracle invoker Beyonder characteristic on Zaratul which had vanished. As for whether there were any additional Beyonder characteristics like Scholar of Yore and Bizarro Sorcerer, Klein had no way of guessing due to his lack of understanding of Zaratul. Based on this situation, Klein had long suspected that Zaratul wasn't completely dead. Of course, if the other party wanted to revive, it wouldn't be that simple. This was because using too simple a method would result in a lack of concealment. It would definitely be discovered by the higher sequence Beyonders of the same pathway, and thus, an effective prevention method would be set up. When Zaratul was able to separate a sequence 2 Beyonder characteristic from himself, he was undoubtedly a sequence 1 attendant of mysteries. There weren't many enemies that could restrain him, ones that had to be dealt with using the most cautious of attitudes. Therefore, Klein believed that he had used the portion of the Beyonder characteristics that he had dissociated from himself to seize an opportunity. However, it wasn't to directly use it to revive. Instead, it was a way to make plenty of preparations. He needed an opportunity or some mediums to make the preparations play out. From the looks of it, he hid that portion of the Beyonder characteristic that contained the miracle invoker Beyonder characteristic in a particular manner and concealed it carefully. Otherwise, when I advanced to Attendant of Mysteries, I should have been able to use Sephira Castle to directly see it. Yes, the next step should be to use some concealed method to guide or entice a specific target to revive him. Hey, he hasn't accommodated a uniqueness, so he can't broadcast on all channels. Besides, he has to be sure that the advanced me or Eamon doesn't hear the corresponding content and spoil his plans. Therefore, the number of targets he can entice is rather limited. All members of the Secret Order, or a portion of the members. Klein, who was genuflecting, nodded in thought. He exhaled and grumbled without hiding anything. Why are high-sequence Beyonders of the Seer pathway so difficult to kill? There were all sorts of preparations and trump cards. This made him truly understand why the goddess didn't directly kill the ancestor of the Antigonus family. For the half-fool, death might mean a new lease of life. However, an intricate and complicated setup often means that the ability to take risks is inferior. Who knows if Zaratul's resurrection plan will benefit some lucky Secret Order member? The possibility of this happening might even be higher than him returning from the fog of history. Also, there's a chance of being interfered, influenced, or exploited by the outer deities. Klein sneered inwardly as he slowly stood up. He temporarily didn't have any thoughts of finding the miracle invoker beyond a characteristic. This was because, under the immense pressure brought by Error Amen, he had no choice but to seize the opportunity to strengthen his humanity and stabilize his mental state. He had to head to Calderon City in the spirit world to retrieve the river water of the River of Eternal Darkness, so as to accommodate the Fool's uniqueness. He had no time to waste on non-urgent matters. By the time he successfully advanced and restored a new balance for the situation he was in, he didn't mind heading to Intis and dealing with the members of the Secret Order in search of the hidden treasure vault that Zaratul had hidden. This would completely put the angel who had lived since the Fourth Epoch to eternal rest. He reined in his thoughts and lowered his head to look at the tombstone in front of him. Klein slowly retreated, inserted his hand into his pocket, and turned to the side to enter the spirit world. In recent times, he was like a tourist in mysticism. Occasionally, he would return to where he used to be, and occasionally, under the guidance of fate, he would casually travel around the spirit world, heading to different realities to witness different scenes. As a result, his self-awareness and self-consciousness gradually recovered and solidified. He was now able to use his anchors to suppress the awakening will of the celestial worthy to a certain extent. This made his mind a lot more stable than when he met the Evernite goddess. In the spirit world, the saturated layers that resembled an abstract oil painting, Klein wandered aimlessly as he walked a few steps in a direction that wasn't in the usual meaning of the word direction. Following the guidance of fate and spirituality, he left this place and returned to the real world. The first thing that appeared before him was a small square and a cathedral belonging to the Evernite goddess. At this moment, many people were entering the cathedral, looking delighted. "I'm back in Backland." Klein looked up at the sun that penetrated the thin clouds and followed the crowd to the cathedral's door. The moment he passed the entrance, his gaze suddenly froze. He saw Benson Moretti. The black-haired, brown-eyed man's face looked somewhat similar to Klein's. However, the slightly older-looking man had his hair combed neatly backward, revealing his broad forehead. He stood beside the altar, wearing a well-ironed suit, looking a little nervous. Klein stared for 2 seconds before quickly looking away. Following that, he swept his gaze across the front pew and saw Melissa in a white, conservative dress. Compared to before, the young lady's face no longer had that adolescent look on it. There was more meat to her face, making her no longer look so skinny. She kept chatting with the people around her, skillfully handling all kinds of matters and socializing. She still dresses in such an old-fashioned manner. Thankfully, she didn't wear black. The corners of Klein's lips curled up as he mumbled. He walked to a corner of the cathedral and found a seat to sit down. About 10 minutes later, Melissa finished her work and sat in her seat. The joyous music started to play as it gradually turned solemn. A lady wearing a clean, white wedding gown held her father's arm in one hand and held her mother's arm with her other. She walked down the aisle towards the altar. Benson, who was standing near the altar, gulped a mouthful of saliva and couldn't help but smile. This was his wedding. Klein, who was in the corner, saw this scene and leaned back a little. He lowered his head slightly and muttered, "He smiles like a curly-haired baboon." After the bride was brought to the front of the altar by her parents, she bowed to Benson before facing the sacred emblem and the priest. Benson bowed and turned around. After the bride's parents sat down, the priest said, "Dear friends and family, we are gathered here today to witness and celebrate the union of this couple in marriage under the auspices of the benevolent goddess. Praise the Lady." All the guests present raised their right hands as long as they were believers of the Evernite goddess before drawing 4 points in a clockwise fashion, drawing out a star. This included Klein. When everyone settled down, the priest turned his head and said to the bride, "Do you, Lucy Brooke, take Benson Moretti to be your lawfully wedded husband, promising to love and cherish, through joy and sorrow, sickness and health, and whatever challenges you may face, for as long as you both shall live?" The lady named Lucy looked at the Evernite goddess's sacred emblem and nodded solemnly. "I do." Benson's smile reappeared. The priest turned to look at him and said, "Do you, Benson Moretti, take Lucy Brooke to be your lawfully wedded wife, promising to love and cherish, through joy and sorrow, sickness and health, and whatever challenges you may face, for as long as you both shall live?" Benson immediately nodded and said, "I do." Upon seeing this and hearing him, Melissa's vision turned blurry. Her heart winced along with joy. After going through all sorts of ups and downs, their family was finally welcoming a new member. Suddenly, she turned her head subconsciously to the corner and saw an empty seat. There was no one there. Melissa immediately pursed her lips and shook her head slightly. After scanning the area for several seconds, she slowly retracted her gaze and looked back at the altar. It wasn't until the priest announced that Benson and Lucy were man and wife did Melissa smile again. In the Hall family manor in Eastchester County, Klein walked out of the void. He had stabilized his mind, and could now seek treatment from his psychiatrist. At the same time, he needed to solve a problem. On the veranda covered by the autumn sun, Audrey wore a refreshing vacation straw hat and sat on a lawn chair as she leisurely flipped through a fashion magazine. There were exquisite pastries and a cup of black tea made from tea leaves from her family's manor on the round table beside her. Suddenly, she looked up to the edge of the veranda and saw Gairman Sparrow walking over in a black trench coat and silk top hat. Audrey turned her head and glanced at her maid, Annie, and realized that she, like the servants around her, ignored the stranger who had appeared out of nowhere. At the same time, Audrey noticed that the surroundings seemed to darken a little. She stood up, lifting the corners of her skirt as she curtsied. During this process, she had originally planned on seriously discussing the matter between the psychology alchemists and Mr. Roth, but on second thought, she smiled again and said in that infectious and brisk tone, "Mr. World, are you here to seek psychological counseling, or to deal with Mr. Roth's problem?" If it was just the former, Audrey believed that the World Gairman Sparrow would let her meet him above the grey fog. That would be more convenient and faster. Therefore, this angel was definitely here under Mr. Fool's instructions to complete a mission in the real world. At the same time, she acutely sensed that Mr. World's emotions were rather mixed. He was satisfied and happy, yet depressed and sad. As Gairman Sparrow's main doctor, this situation wasn't rare. It often meant that he needed a certain degree of counseling or comfort. Both. Klein pulled a chair over and sat by the round table. "Do you want black tea or coffee?" Although Audrey hadn't taken the initiative to investigate Mr. World, she had met Dwayne Dantes many times before. They had attended meetings, banquets, and dances together, and under the keen observation of a spectator, many details weren't secrets. For example, Audrey knew that when Dwayne Dantes was Gairman Sparrow, he preferred food that was sweet with a little sourness. He liked to drink coffee with sugar without milk. For black tea, he loved having lemon slices. Out of all the pastries, his first choice was the cream pastries. He loved foie gras, roasted chicken skin, and loved ribeye steaks more than beef tenderloin. His love for desi pie far exceeded bread. In addition, Audrey was undoubtedly certain that the other party was a spice enthusiast. He had high expectations of condiments, and his preferences in this aspect were inclined towards that of Desi County. Due to these details, Audrey believed that it would be very rude to not invite Mr. World to enjoy the pastries on the table. And the beverage of choice to match these snacks was undoubtedly either black tea or coffee. "Black tea," Klein answered after some thought. Miss Justice's relaxed and amiable attitude made him feel much more at ease. He felt that this state would be more beneficial for the subsequent, placating. Since that was the case, it would definitely be better for him to enjoy the pastries while receiving psychological treatment. "Give me another cup of black tea and add a lemon slice," Audrey said to her maid, Annie. Annie wasn't surprised by the instructions, finding everything reasonable. She turned around and walked to the veranda's entrance, giving instructions to the servants standing there. Audrey wasn't in a rush to begin the psychological treatment process, nor did she ask Mr. World why he was in a complicated mood. She smiled as she carefully introduced the local products of the manor. She made a comparison with Dwayne Dantes's Mega Manor and naturally informed him of the present situation regarding his butler and servants. Some stayed in the manor and continued the previous work. With Mega Manor's production, it was perfectly fine sustaining them. There was even some surplus that could be converted to funds to repair the houses and be donated to charity organizations. Audrey only sent an accountant, an assistant butler, and a staff member from the foundation to do a check on them. Some felt that, without a true employer, they couldn't play their role to their fullest potential. They felt ashamed of the salary they received and chose to resign and look for work. Some of them developed an interest in charity work and found a new calling to life and joined one of the foundations under Audrey's name. Klein listened silently, occasionally raising a question, as though he was chatting with a friend. When the tea was served, he took a sip and nodded in satisfaction. After watching him eat a piece of cream cake, Audrey's green eyes darted around as she said with a smile, "Food doesn't seem to be necessary for an angel, right?" "Yes, it's just a hobby," Klein answered simply before adding, "It can be used to maintain one's humanity." Maintain one's humanity. Audrey ruminated over the sentence. This is to resist the godhood within you. Your mental problems come under such a category. She gently guided the topic to his psychological treatment. Klein nodded slightly and said, "That's right. You should have experienced it. Every Beyonder who has obtained godhood will definitely experience it in some way. The difference is in the quantity." Audrey seriously recalled and said, "I occasionally dream of a ball of light that illuminated the entire world. Occasionally, I would hear an indescribable sound, and I would see a blurry, strange, illusory ocean that seemed to contain many conflicting thoughts. I'm certain that it was an illusion, but it was also so real. Well, I occasionally dream of a huge cross. I heard someone praying softly, but I couldn't tell the specifics no matter how I tried. The second is likely from the Sephira, Chaos Sea, and the indirect corruption from within. The third is visionary Adam beginning to exert influence on the Beyonders of the same pathway. The first one is the primordial one awakening in the ancient sun god's body, the ancient God Almighty." Klein thought for a moment before saying in a deep voice, "The original creator created all living things and also split into various Beyonder characteristics. This is the source of being extraordinary. Therefore, every one of us has godhood in our bodies. They have the original creator's will. The more Beyonder characteristics gathered, the more he will awaken and replace us." He used the most common and most ambiguous method to explain the root of the problem in a way that wouldn't lead to corruption. This had been discussed to a certain extent at the Tarot Club, so Audrey didn't find it difficult to understand. She said thoughtfully, "That's why one needs to use one's humanity to resist godhood. At the same time, anchors are needed. Yes, the light you dream of, the indescribable sounds you hear, and the illusory ocean that you see are all a type of corruption. And the gigantic cross and prayer sounds should be a result of the influence that visionary Adam has on the Beyonders of the same pathway." Klein explained the two different situations. Audrey subconsciously sat up straight and looked around. She appeared a little afraid. Gehrman Sparrow actually said the name of the he who must not be named. "Don't worry. He can't hear me with me by your side," Klein explained. Audrey retracted her gaze and didn't hide her surprise and astonishment. "You've already advanced to Sequence 1. Isn't that too fast?" He had only become a Sequence 2 angel slightly more than half a year ago. Klein answered frankly, "More like a king of angels." Quote ellipsis quote. Audrey was silent for a few seconds. She pursed her lips and said with a vexed smile, "I nearly had a psychological problem just now." Klein chuckled as well. "To me, becoming a king of angels isn't necessarily a good thing. Yes, high sequence Beyonders of the spectator pathway have to pay particular attention to their mental state. To other pathways, the enhancement of godhood and the worsening corruption is rather obvious. But this isn't the case for a spectator. You have to constantly inspect and check yourself. Any tiny changes to one's personality and their understanding of things should be traced back to the source. It must be confirmed that there are no problems and that the difference can be considered a normal change. Otherwise, you'll unknowingly become another person who can coldly kill those who you originally wanted to protect. It's not easy for Beyonders of the spectator pathway to go crazy, but it's also the easiest for them to go crazy." Audrey replied in shock, "I understand." She continued the topic and began asking, "Your mental state is unstable, and you have a psychological problem. Is it because you became a king of angels in such a short period of time that it exceeded your expectations?" "Yes." Klein drank a mouthful of black tea and said, "The will that doesn't belong to me within me has mostly awakened. I can only barely suppress it and maintain some basic level of mental stability." As Audrey listened to Gehrman Sparrow's description, she used her Beyonder powers to observe and analyze him. After the other party finished speaking, she revealed a comforting smile and said, "I roughly understand your current situation. The initial treatment plan is divided into 2 steps. I'll first enter your mind world and awaken the memories related to your humanity. Oh, it doesn't include the kind that will make you so miserable that you wish to give up. Then, when your godhood reacts, I'll use placate, hypnotism, and other Beyonder powers to reduce the corruption and the negative effects it brings, so as to help you better suppress it." Klein was silent for a moment before saying, "Okay. He decided to use his unique trait of maintaining lucidity in the dream and the mind world, and first gather up the memories related to the Fool before grafting them to the worms of spirit above the grey fog. At that moment, Audrey got her maid, Annie, to bring over a white silk scarf. Then, she used the thin scarf to cover her eyes and ears. Klein watched this scene in puzzlement as he waited for Miss Justice to explain. After tying the scarf, Audrey smiled and said, "This is a hypnotism that allows me to seal my spirit body's perception. This way, even if I were to enter your mind world, I wouldn't be able to hear or see those awakened memories. Of course, I'll keep my spiritual intuition, otherwise, I wouldn't be able to find your island of consciousness, and I wouldn't be able to sense the changes in your godhood. I could have just hypnotized you, but you're already a king of angels. I'm worried that I'll be affected by your consciousness, so I'm using this symbolic ritual to achieve the state of being hypnotized and strengthen the effects." She calmly explained, calming Klein's mood without him realizing it. He nodded gently and said, "All right, let's begin." After opening the door to the body of heart and mind, Klein carefully extracted the memories related to the Fool. He gathered them together and grafted them above the grey fog. Following that, he saw the blonde-haired Audrey, who had a light white silk scarf covering her eyes, appear on the ancient stone steps. Step by step, she landed onto his mind island via the sea of collective subconscious. After some hesitation, Klein no longer allowed his consciousness to stay high in the sky. He gave up the corresponding control and allowed them to return and fuse together. If he didn't do that, he would maintain absolute rationality in the subsequent treatment, making him unable to be moved by all kinds of memories and lose the possibility of strengthening his humanity. This meant that Audrey's treatment was destined to fail right from the start. After arriving at the mind island that resembled a dream world using her spiritual intuition, Audrey stopped and spread her arms slightly. She recalled her parents' love for her, the excitement she felt when she first became a Beyonder, and the joy she felt after helping others to change her emotions and emit corresponding fluctuations. This was a method of awakening Gehrman Sparrow's memories related to his humanity. It was a Beyonder manifestation of the effects of empathy. Scenes that were worth cherishing, or those hiding deep within, flashed across Audrey's mind one after another. Beneath her feet, from the surface of the island that represented Klein's mind, firefly-like light points seeped out of the soil and floated up. Every point of light presented a different scene: a kid taking a stride forward with his short legs, receiving an ice cream, a student secretly reading novels and comics under the cover of a textbook, a teenager sitting in front of his computer and playing games with full focus. Hearing the sound of a key suddenly being inserted into a keyhole, he jumped up and performed a force shutdown on his computer. Rushing back to his room, happy that his actions weren't discovered, he had a bounce in his step. Going to the living room, he asked his mother for pocket money, before appearing beside his father to casually ask questions about his studies, a young adult and his companions pushing a bashful friend to the corridor, right up to the person he had a crush on. Then, turning around, he laughed loudly, a young adult with some hint of adolescence to him stealing a glance downstairs, watching a figure leave, but unable to open his mouth no matter what, an employee with a slightly protruding belly waving his hand impatiently when he returned home for the holidays. After telling his parents not to serve him food or set up blind dates for him, he sees his parents' white hair and loses himself in thought when he calmed down, a scholarly-looking man and his brother and sister moving out. When they saw the dirt and dust on each other's faces, they laughed. Klein sat at the round table at the veranda, one hand holding his top hat and the other hanging in midair, as though he wanted to cover his face. Two transparent drops of water slowly slid past the two sides of his nose bridge and dripped into the void. Klein closed his eyes, his expression soft and pained. In his mind island, Audrey seemed to have transformed into a whirlpool of emotions as she pulled together similar memories. After the entire island was covered in firefly-like points of light, a faint grey fog emerged. In the fog, there was a door of light that was dyed bluish-black. It was formed from illusory and brilliant spherical light. The main body of each spherical light was composed of transparent, ringed, or starlight-like worms and insects. They embraced each other and intertwined like mythical creatures. The door of light looked a little odd at first glance, but if one looked closely, they would discover that its surroundings were dark. It was as though it was wearing a hooded black robe. Thus, on a whole, it looked like an unknown mysterious person hiding under a robe. In the next second, a slippery, illusory tentacle appeared under the deep black robe of the mysterious person. At that moment, although Audrey's consciousness couldn't see or hear anything, her spiritual intuition gave her a strong sense of danger. She had a feeling that a sea consisting of corruption was about to drown her. No, this isn't an illusion. She believed that if things continued to develop like this, she would get infected with a severe mental illness, or even lose control and go crazy on the spot. Audrey was just about to placate herself with all her might, weakening the corruption ahead of her when the firefly-like light dots floating above the island rapidly gathered. They illuminated the grayish-white fog, diluting the darkness around the strange door of light, making the tentacles covered in mysterious patterns shrink back. This was also the reason why Klein could receive psychological treatment only after barely suppressing the awakening celestial worthy's consciousness. This made Audrey sense the weakening of the danger, and she quickly did a psychoanalysis. Then, she immediately placated the corruption, performing a true act of hypnosis. After repeating it over and over again, Audrey took an unknown amount of time before she finally managed to obtain the initial results she expected. She then left Gehrman Sparrow's mind island and returned to her body. This treatment was very difficult, so she didn't use a virtual persona, and directly used her body of heart and mind. After sensing the end of the treatment, Klein raised his hand to wipe his face, allowing the fool's memories, grafted above the gray fog, to return to his true body. A few seconds later, Audrey removed the white silk scarf wrapped around her eyes and nose, snapping herself out of her self-hypnosis. She looked at Mr. World opposite her and muttered to herself poignantly, "Is this the mental problem brought by godhood? How terrifying." Klein nodded slightly and said, "Yes, every angel has one. The only difference is whether it's serious or very serious. Saints have it too. Even low and mid-sequence beyonders who aren't demigods will have it too." Audrey added with Gehrman Sparrow's former explanation. To a low or mid-sequence beyonder, the remnant mental imprint of the former owner of the characteristic is relatively more dangerous. Klein picked up the gold-lined cup and took a sip. This is the cruel law of the mysterious world. This is because our beyonder powers come from external objects, from the beyonder characteristics. Audrey nodded before shaking her head gently. As she contemplated, she said, "I don't think it's that pessimistic, just like the source of every human life comes from something else, air, bread, meat, water, etc. When we absorb them, we will also absorb their negative effects, accumulating all kinds of problems that eventually make us fall sick. However, this doesn't mean that we have to completely resist them and treat them as external objects. Once they're absorbed, there will always be some part of it that belongs to us. I didn't express it well, but I believe you should understand what I mean." Klein was taken aback for a moment before replying thoughtfully, "A beyonder's acquisition of a beyonder characteristic is like humans having food. Then, one should have peace of mind and not have too many repulsive thoughts. It's about resisting it, but also working alongside it, and suppressing it, but also fusing together with it. Roughly like that." After Audrey said that, she laughed self-deprecatingly. However, this also seems to imply a negative message: humans will eventually die, but beyonders. She didn't finish her sentence, unwilling to agitate the patient opposite her. She switched topics and said, "Pay a visit another 2 times this week. I'll be able to stabilize you under normal conditions." "Yes, normal conditions. Also, you can reminisce about things when you're free, or go somewhere you yearn to go." Klein nodded and said, "What do you have in mind about Roth's suggestion?" The smile on Audrey's face slowly disappeared as her expression gradually turned serious. "Do you have any suggestions?" Klein put down his teacup and calmly said, "Strictly speaking, the danger you bring is divided into 2 categories. One is when you actively or passively involve yourself in certain matters, attracting powerful enemies to your side, implicating your family, relatives, friends, and the innocent. The other is that your very existence allows some factions to target the people you value the most, doing so to threaten you. For the latter, unless you're dead, there's no way for you to ever avoid them. Of course, most of these things are a result of the former. If you give up on all your current identities in the mysticism world, and only be Mr. Fool's believer and Miss Audrey Hall from now on, no longer taking the initiative to participate in matters related to beyonder or other matters with unpredictable elements, you can avoid most of the risks of the former and drastically reduce the latter. Under such circumstances, with the Evernite goddess favoring the Hall family, and Mr. Fool's protection provided to you is enough to deal with the rare instances of dangers, ensuring your family's safety. That's why there's no need to split off another identity." Audrey fell silent for a while. She bit her lower lip indiscernibly and asked, "What if I do want to split off an identity?" As long as you let that identity believe in Mr. Fool, it's not much different from what I said just now. The only difference is that, from this point forth, you'll have to stay away from your family and friends and live with another identity. Klein's voice sank slightly as he said in a serious tone, also, are you really fine with Hermes splitting off an identity for you? Audrey's emotions were disrupted by this question. Her eyes flickered as she said, however, splitting identities should be beyond the powers of a Sequence 3 Dreamweaver. She definitely wouldn't be able to accomplish it by herself. The corners of Klein's mouth curled up as he suddenly asked, "You're able to use that pride mask to enter the Garden of Eden directly?" As Audrey couldn't take the initiative to mention the psychology alchemists, he very directly pointed it out. Audrey nodded gently, surprised, puzzled, and guessed something. "I'm unable to pay the equivalent price, and..." Without waiting for her to finish, Klein said with a cold expression, "On the one hand, Adam has drifted from Mr. Fool and nearly killed me. On the other hand, with the apocalypse approaching, Mr. Fool has prophesied something. When the time comes, he might fall asleep again. As his blessed, I won't be able to escape a similar fate. The payment you need to pay is that, when such an anomaly happens, perform certain dangerous things according to Mr. Fool's instructions and try hard to awaken him." Without giving Miss Justice a chance to digest this sentence, Klein extended his right hand and grabbed a few times at the void ahead of him, pulling out a grayish-white, cold persona mask. Using his status and Audrey's trust in him, he forcefully summoned the projection of the pride mask from the historical void. "It's connected to my mind, so no one else can use it." Audrey subconsciously pointed out the problem when she saw this. "Give me a strand of hair," Klein said calmly. Audrey didn't think too much about it. She plucked out a strand of blonde hair and handed it to Gehrman Sparrow. Klein took the strand of hair and wrapped it in the eye holes in the persona mask. Then, he held his silk hat in one hand and the grayish-white mask in the other as he slowly stood up. During this process, he mobilized Sephira Castle and, deceived, the rules. Klein wore the pride mask without facing any resistance. Immediately, he saw human-clothed animals walking upright. He had entered the Garden of Eden directly. Looking at the black cathedral in the middle of the city, Klein curled his lips and took out the Staff of the Stars and wore the silk top hat over his head. The moment they sensed the intrusion of a stranger, the animals wearing cloaks or exquisite long skirts stirred as they looked at Klein with the desire to attack. At that instant, Klein, who was wearing the pride mask, felt as though he was an enemy of the entire city. He wasn't unfamiliar with the situation in the Garden of Eden. He knew that the upright animals dressed as humans were in different aspects of bestial desires. They were more like conceptual and abstract entities instead of being physical. In other words, they didn't have spirit-body threads, so they wouldn't suffer any physical harm. Otherwise, Klein could have hoisted these animals up, allowing them to sway with the wind. In the next second, with the bear whose suit was about to rip apart taking the lead, the animals in the Garden of Eden either bared their fangs or let out low growls as they surged towards Klein from all directions. Once bitten or hugged by them, one would be corrupted by the corresponding bestial desire. One could only rely on their willpower or the various beyond powers of the spectator pathway to resist them. Faced with such a situation, Klein, who was wearing a half-top hat, tapped the Staff of the Stars. Without panicking in the slightest, he raised his left hand, spread his fingers, and suddenly closed them. The Garden of Eden, formed from Gothic-style architecture, was suddenly covered in a layer of gloom, as if a giant curtain had draped over it. Realm of the Mysteries, the embryonic form of a divine kingdom. Klein sealed off the Garden of Eden to prevent the powerhouses inside from escaping. Following that, he walked forward one step at a time, like a gentleman taking an after-meal stroll. The animals who mimicked humans by wearing human clothes rushed to his side when they naturally changed directions and embraced each other. The python with its flicking tongue devoured a canine creature filled with the desire to mate. The strange person with a colorful spider as a face bound a huge, red-eyed rat up with a web. A violent werewolf bit the languid cat. The brown bear walking upright gave the fox with shiny fur a bear hug. These animals that represented bestial desire fused together as they cancelled each other out in pairs. Klein, who had grasped the authority of grafting, slowly walked through them, as though he was inspecting the concepts of humanity and bestial desires. Just like that, he walked to the 80-meter-tall cathedral and stopped. Then, he lifted his head and looked at the skulls embedded in the black pillar for 2 seconds. Klein's expression didn't change at all. He raised his left hand to press down his hat and walked up the stairs into the cathedral. He immediately saw a grand and spacious hall, with a huge cross and a greyish-white dragon statue wrapped around the cross. In front of the cross was a small long table with 5 seats on both sides of the long table. At this moment, at the end of the long table, there was a man in a black wheelchair. His face was abnormally pale, and his pale yellow eyebrows were long. His hair was neatly combed, and there were some wrinkles on his forehead. This was the leader of the psychology alchemists, Paulie Durlaw. At the same time, he was also the famous hermit Eric Drake, and the king of the Black Throne Barros Hopkins. Of course, whether he was the main body or one of his various identities, no one knew. Seeing Gairman Sparrow, who was wearing a silk top hat and a black trench coat, walk over slowly and in an extremely oppressive manner, Paulie Durlaw clasped the armrest of the wheelchair with both hands. When the other party entered the Garden of Eden, he didn't hesitate to leave this mind city, but he failed to do so. The eyes beneath the pride mask that seemed to move towards his forehead seemed to be mocking him. Phew! Paulie Durlaw quickly placated his emotions before his eyes lit up with a pure, illusory light. This light formed a pair of holy wings in front of him. Under the layers of wings, there was a pious person of light genuflecting in prayer. This was an angel. At the same time, an elder with white hair and ordinary looks appeared to the left of Paulie Durlaw. To his right, a priest with a pale blonde beard covering his face stood up. Ancient Angel, Hermes. Visionary Adam. Klein didn't stop walking forward as he muttered to himself, "I wish for all illusions to disappear." Just as he said that, he raised his left hand and snapped his fingers. The Angel of Light, Hermes, and Visionary Adam, instantly dissipated and vanished, leaving behind a single Paulie Durlaw sitting in the black wheelchair. He had just used the beyonder powers of a dreamweaver to weave a few almost realistic images. Once the enemy believed that they were real, they would become real. Although the damage they caused didn't have any physical manifestations, it would make the target die for unknown reasons. Paulie Durlaw has made countless targets die from fright in such nightmares. Unfortunately, he had encountered Klein, a king of angels who could maintain his lucidity in dreams and also possessed true vision. He used the wishes power of a miracle invoker to easily crack the illusion. Seeing this, Paulie Durlaw's eyelids twitched. Without any hesitation, he pushed himself up from the black wheelchair. During this process, his body rapidly expanded as he transformed into a huge grayish-white dragon. Dragon transformation. An incomplete mythical creature form. Compared to a sequence form manipulator, the incomplete mythical creature form that Paulie Durlaw exhibited was even larger. Furthermore, there was a certain change to his head, making it closer to a lizard and not a human. It had golden vertical pupils and scales that were intertwined with mysterious patterns, making it cold and warped. As the incomplete mythical creature form appeared, all kinds of thoughts, consciousness, desires, and will swept out like a storm, attacking Klein's mind island in half illusory and half realistic ways. This was a combination of mind deprivation and mental plague, allowing every creature that was affected to experience corruption and go crazy on the spot. To an angel, such attacks were the most sinister. This was because all of them had certain problems with their mental states. They could lose control at any moment due to the tilting of the scales. Klein, who was wearing the grayish-white pride mask and half-top hat, didn't stop walking forward. He didn't attempt to avoid the plague storm at the mental level. He remained firm and stoic as he walked step by step towards Paulie Durlaw. In the next second, transparent insects appeared on the back of his hand. His clothes expanded as though countless indescribable monsters were crawling underneath. Suddenly, Klein lost control and turned into a huge whirlpool formed by transparent maggots. The vortex extended out slippery tentacles with strange patterns. In the middle, there was a door of light that was dyed bluish-black. Upon seeing this scene, even in his incomplete mythical creature form, Paulie Durlaw found it difficult to stop his thoughts from coming to a halt as he stood rooted to the ground. The massive grayish-white dragon seemed to have become a puppet, its head was filled with mush and its joints were all rusted. He had stared straight at a great existence that he shouldn't look at. Above the grey fog, Klein, who was sitting at the fool's seat, immediately dispersed the out-of-control historical projection. After entering the Garden of Eden and pulling out the Staff of the Stars, he had switched places with the historical void projection that the Worms of Spirit inside Sephira Castle had summoned, and directly returned to his ancient palace. He clearly knew that Visionary Adam had gone to the forsaken land of the gods and was attempting to fuse with the true Creator, making it impossible for him to descend with his true body any time in the short foreseeable future. At most, he would send out one of his other identities, but it would be useless against a king of kings of angels. However, Klein still felt that he should be cautious, lest he fall into Adam's or Amon's trap. Following that, he summoned himself from the fog of history. He wore the pride mask and held the staff of the stars in his hand as he projected himself back into the cathedral of the Garden of Eden. Seeing that Paulie Durlaw had lost most of his rationality and was unable to control his body, Klein didn't directly control his spirit-body threads to turn the mind dragon into his marionette. He maintained his pace as he slowly approached the target. In Paulie Durlaw's eyes, Gehrman Sparrow was like death incarnate. He approached him slowly with his own rhythm, but there was no chance of escape. At that moment, the grayish-white dragon statue on the huge cross behind him moved. Almost simultaneously, Klein raised his left hand and pulled downwards. The shadow curtain that enveloped the Garden of Eden instantly contracted, enveloping the huge cross, the grayish-white dragon statue, and Paulie Durlaw within. In the next second, Klein raised the curtain. The incomplete mythical creature that Paulie Durlaw had transformed into combined with the gigantic cross as though it was a knotted giant tree. And the grayish-white dragon statue connected the entirety of the Garden of Eden, turning the city outside the cathedral into an abnormally illusory sea that contained all colors. This wasn't the chaos sea, rather the loaning of its strength. It had been tampered by Klein and reassembled. At that moment, Gehrman Sparrow, who had been walking slowly forward, arrived beside the knotted giant tree. He raised his right hand, and under the vacant yet slightly fearful gaze of Paulie Durlaw, he lashed out with the staff of the stars. This cane that was embedded with many gems hit the target heavily, separating it into two. Between the sounds of parts falling to the ground, Paulie Durlaw's body that had been combined with the huge cross fell to the ground. The leader of the psychology alchemists died before he could even say his last words. While waiting for Paulie Durlaw's Beyonder characteristic to appear, Klein looked around and chuckled inwardly. As expected, Hermes's true goal was to use the faction backing Miss Justice to destroy the Garden of Eden and use it to escape from Adam. The Mind Dragon, Ariahog's words made him steal his resolve. However, he should have still left a few sealed artifacts for me. There's no need to abscond with everything. Could it be that the rabbit should be wearing a greed mask instead of wrath? The psychology alchemists might appear again in the future, but the one controlling it in the shadows is no longer the Twilight Hermit Order, but Hermes himself. Retracting his gaze, Klein cast his gaze at the Beyonder characteristic that Paulie Durlaw's body had produced. It was formed from thin mist, seemingly an unreal, grayish-white brain from a dream. He believed that the Garden of Eden was the safest place, so he placed his true body here. All activities in the outside world are just his many different identities. Who would have known that Hermes, who was supposed to be a defensive barrier, had abandoned this place? If a real angel were guarding the Garden of Eden and had fully utilized the uniqueness of this mind city, I wouldn't be able to so easily deceive the rules and successfully infiltrate it. As Klein thought to himself, he randomly made a wish to accelerate the Beyonder characteristics formation and condensation. He snapped his fingers and fulfilled his wish. Following that, he picked up the Dreamweaver Beyonder characteristic and something that could be used as the supplementary material. He took off the pride mask on his face and left the Garden of Eden. As he left, the remaining parts of the city collapsed and merged into the boundless sea of collective subconscious. From that point onward, the legend of the Garden of Eden would emerge in many dreams, eventually drawn out by some artists, or fabricated into widespread stories. And all of the stories would come to a consensus: the Garden of Eden was eventually destroyed. Returning to the Hall family manor's veranda, Klein looked at Miss Justice, who had already composed herself, and handed over the Dreamweaver Beyonder characteristics, the corresponding ingredients, and the potion formula he had seen from the second blasphemy slate. Before Audrey could say anything, he said in a deep voice, "You can go back on your word," before officially advancing. Audrey received Mr. World's gift and nodded silently, indicating that she would seriously consider it. Wearing the exquisite straw hat, she watched Gehrman Sparrow turn around and walk to the edge of the veranda, disappearing step by step. After removing his traces and concealing the clues, Klein cleverly used grafting and the uniqueness of Sephira Castle to return to Backland, appearing in front of Judgment Zio, who was on holiday. The MI9 colonel, who was munching on an apple, immediately put down the food in her hands. As she wiped her mouth with a tissue, she stood up. What's the matter? She cautiously didn't address him as Mr. World, nor did she call him Gehrman Sparrow. Klein nodded slightly and said, Mr. Fool got me to ask you if you wished to obtain the potion formula, beyond a characteristic, and supplementary ingredients for Sequence 4 Imperative Mage. Zio frowned slightly, not feeling any joy. She asked solemnly, then, what's the price? Klein nodded approvingly. The apocalypse is coming. Many changes are beginning to happen, and Mr. Fool has prophesied some matters. When the time comes, it's very likely that he will enter a period of slumber again. And as his blessed, his left-hand man, I'm unable to escape the same fate. The price you need to pay is that when such a situation really appears, follow the revelation left behind by Mr. Fool, doing something that might be dangerous or simple. It might be an attempt that will take a long while, or just a short moment, so as to awaken Mr. Fool. As a King of Angels seer, the owner of Sephira Castle, Klein had long been able to make certain levels of prophecies. Recently, he had seen some blurry visions and inspiration. Therefore, without any solid plan, he consciously started putting in place various arrangements. Right now, I'm a real charlatan, he lampooned himself in thought. Before Zio could speak, he added, you can choose to decline. You are not the only person chosen. Zio believed that Mr. World wouldn't use sarcasm when it came to such matters. She didn't immediately answer as she seriously considered the matter. Without the pending apocalypse, she felt that she would have rejected the offer. Although a demigod was powerful and terrifying, being able to rule a battlefield and control the fates of others, and was a creature that truly possessed godhood, becoming a Sequence 4 wasn't a matter that was urgent for her. As a Sequence 5 disciplinary paladin, she was able to ensure that she completed most of the missions as a Colonel of Me-9, with her own capabilities. With her salary and additional income, she could maintain a very decent life for her family. Even if she were to encounter danger, she could obtain sufficient aid from the official factions. Furthermore, she could make preparations by getting Leymano's travels in advance, and ask her friend, Forz, to protect her in secret. In addition, she had investigated the cause of her father's death and fulfilled her wish to restore his honor. Therefore, no matter what, she didn't have to pay the huge price to become a Sequence 4 Beyonder. Besides, it wasn't impossible for her to get an opportunity from MI9. Of course, Zio had no idea how much longer until this would happen in the future. Be it Mr. Fool's warning, or the various prophecies I deliberately gathered using my job, it clearly or vaguely points out that the apocalypse is coming. There are only 16 years left. Zio subconsciously turned her body to look at the second floor. Under my present living conditions, Mom will definitely be able to live for another 16 years. At that time, she wouldn't be too old. Furthermore, Mr. Moon has provided all kinds of medicine to maintain her health. 16 years later, Rio will be a young man in his prime, at the peak of his career. Forz might already become a Sequence 3 Beyonder, and in order to deal with the apocalypse and seek hope, she would be busy running around, but I wouldn't be of much help. Zio slowly retracted her gaze as she fell silent. Then, she looked at the World Gehrman Sparrow and nodded solemnly. Okay, you can set up a ritual at any time and make a wish to Mr. Fool. He will fulfill your wish. Klein didn't waste any time and gave a simple explanation. His Imperative Mage Beyonder characteristic and potion formula were all obtained from the New Moon City sacrifice. Of course, he had also bestowed his believers with the sealed artifact, General of the Pupil-less Eye, in exchange. After Zio made her decision, she stopped worrying about the matter and said, Wendell apparently went to Utopia, but strangely, he returned that very night and didn't go to court to testify. That makes him puzzled and worried. Tell him that there's no need to worry about this matter anymore. All the people of Utopia were buried in a natural disaster. With that said, Klein turned and walked into the spirit world. In the outskirts of Backland East Borough, in a cemetery, Klein silently looked at the niches filled with urns of ashes and didn't look away for a long time. After a while, he slowly walked under a tree's shade. He took out the historical projection of the adventurer's harmonica and blew it. With 4 blonde, red-eyed heads and dressed in a dark and complicated long dress, Rionette Tinnicker immediately walked out of the void. Without waiting for Miss Messenger to speak, Klein asked, The various churches are preparing to besiege the Rose School of Thought and plan on joining forces with you. Is there anything I can help you with? He had learned of the matter from Leonard and Emlyn. Rionette Tinnicker's 4 blonde, red-eyed head said, There's nothing, for now, talk, after, locking on. Target. That is to say that, with the interference in divination, and prophecies, and the protection from outer deities like the Mother Tree of Desire, Primordial Moon, as well as kings of angels like the Chained God, the Rose School of Thought demigods aren't that easy to find. They need a certain amount of time to employ various strategies. That's right. Even a Rhodes wouldn't dare spy on them under such circumstances. Perhaps I can summon its historical void projection. Klein thought for a moment and said, if there are items directly related to them, using them as a medium I can lock onto the corresponding target. When the time came, he could use Sephira Castle's power to penetrate the shield. Alright. Rionette Tinniker's 4 beautiful heads bobbed up and down at the same time. With nothing left to discuss, he planned on letting Miss Messenger return. He had originally intended to jokingly ask, do I need to pay for the summoning this time? His spiritual perception suddenly stirred as he fell silent. A few seconds later, he took out a gold coin from Sephira Castle. This was one of the 5 gold coins that had been tainted by Sephira Castle's aura. The payment this time. Klein handed over the gold coin with a smile. No need. This time. After Rionette Tinniker's 2 blonde, red-eyed heads said that, the remaining 2 didn't say anything. She had powerful spiritual perception capabilities, and appeared as though she had sensed something. In the next second, one of the 2 blonde, red-eyed heads that didn't open its mouth rose up and bit the gold coin at Klein's fingertip. Alright, Klein retracted his hand and said with a smile. Then, he casually asked, is Miss Sharon and Marich still in Backland? Yes, Miss Messenger informed Klein about her student's address. In a house, Marich sat at a long table and skillfully played cards with his zombies. Suddenly, Sherlock Moriarty appeared on an empty chair. He put down his hat and took the covered cards from a zombie without any hesitation. Marich looked up at him. His lips moved, but he didn't open them in the end. He let the zombie in charge of croupier duties continue to hand out the cards. Just like that, Klein joined them. He played a few rounds, winning and losing at times. In the corner, Sharon, who was wearing a black regal dress and a small and delicate bonnet, appeared at some point in time. She held her face with one hand and quietly watched the game. After playing for about 2 hours, Klein stood up and formally bowed to Miss Sharon and Marich. Then, he chuckled, put on his hat, walked towards the door, and disappeared. Deep in the spirit world, Klein, who had finished a course of 3 treatments, appeared outside Calderon City. As he didn't know what state Eamon was in right now, Klein didn't dare delay. After his mental problems were resolved, he immediately came to Calderon City and prepared to obtain the river water of the River of Eternal Darkness. And because it involved a Sephira, he could only vaguely see some visions when using divination or making a prophecy. He couldn't accurately make a judgment. After surveying the area, Klein raised his hand to summon the historical void projection from a few minutes ago, allowing his true body to return to Sephira Castle. His consciousness then shifted to the projection, making it corporeal. Following that, Klein grabbed at the void again and pulled out the Staff of the Stars' historical projection. To be honest, after being able to use most of the Beyonder powers below Sequence 0 of the Apprentice pathway through Sephira Castle, Klein no longer needed a Grade 0 sealed artifact like the Staff of the Stars. He could basically replicate whatever mystical effects it had without the negative effects. However, he always felt that an angel still had to possess a close combat weapon because it was possible to fall into a region that nullified Beyonder powers at some point in time. In the mysterious world, this was definitely something that could happen. Be it the law restrictions from the Arbiter pathway, or the Beyonder effects of a particular outer deity, it was possible to achieve similar effects. Under such circumstances, if he picked up a hard staff that came with passive effects and directly smashed it in the enemy's head, it would prove to be rather effective. As a king of angels of the seer pathway, making preparations in all aspects was an instinct. After weighing the Staff of the Stars and pressing down on his top hat, Klein took out the golden bird-shaped accessory from Sephira Castle and placed it in his left breast pocket. Then, he took a step and entered Calderon City, the divine kingdom of ancient death, Phoenix ancestor Greggrace. The first thing that entered his vision was a huge bottomless pit. All sorts of strange buildings circled the deep pit and extended downwards in circles, forming a grand city that was beyond the understanding of ordinary people. Some of the buildings were standalone houses that stood atop pale white stone pillars, while others were huge rectangular coffins. There were no windows, and the doors were on the roofs. Some of them were just tombs with gravestones at the entrance, while others were constructed from all kinds of bones, making them seem rather messy. The closer to the bottom of the pit, the more intact the buildings were. The closer they got to the top, the more they collapsed, filled with the decay and ruin of time. With just a glance, Klein made a faint grayish-white fog appear around him. He directly used Sephira Castle's status to resist the laws of Calderon City, which turned all living beings into the dead. To him, becoming a dead person wasn't a negative effect, but he didn't like that cold and indifferent feeling. The grayish-white tide that rose previously has receded. Klein, who was wearing a top hat and trench coat while carrying the staff, nodded in thought. With one step, he stepped deep into Calderon City, which could be seen with the naked eye. This time, he used the marauder pathways beyond her powers to steal the distance of his perception so as to avoid being entangled with the various dangerous monsters that were active in this mysterious city. This wasn't something he was afraid of. The ones who should be afraid were the monsters. If it wasn't for the fact that he didn't wish to waste time, he wouldn't have minded taking the opportunity to gather a batch of marionettes to make up for the losses caused by the destruction of Utopia. Apart from this reason, Klein was still cautious about something else. Calderon City was a city of the dead. It was very likely that in the deepest depths of the city flowed the river of eternal darkness. And in essence, marionettes were already dead, so once they approached anywhere close to the bottom, there was a possibility of a mutation. Venturing deeper one step at a time, Klein realized that he had thought too much. None of the monsters hidden in this strange city dared to appear. The aura of Sephira Castle allowed their instinctual desire to live to overcome their inclinations of madness and their habits of hunting. The deeper he went, the quieter his surroundings became. The strange buildings remained intact, but they seemed to be dead for years. Even their auras were cold, gloomy, and decadent. It's the same as looking at a black and white film. If I didn't hear my breathing and heartbeat, I would have suspected that I was deaf. Klein coughed lightly and used his grumbling to resist the silence of death. His intuition told him that once he got used to this environment, his body and mind would become still and silent. Then, he would truly die in the full meaning of the word. The closer he got to the ground, the stronger this feeling became. As he kept stealing the distance, Klein proceeded forward for a long time before finally seeing the bottom of the pit. No, this wasn't the true base of the pit. It was just a huge, black palace that stood in the way. The palace was propped up by columns. There were all kinds of bones and different corpse pieces embedded in them. Some parts of the palace were even covered in blood. They belonged to different races. Klein stared at it for a few seconds. Without any hesitation, he carried the Staff of the Stars and entered the palace through the open door. On both sides of the hall were different types of coffins in different colors. They sat there silently, as if they had already been weathered by death. As Klein entered, there was a sudden noise coming from inside the coffins. It sounded like a rusted joint opening. The grayish-white fog around Klein thickened again as all the coffins suddenly quietened down. Ignoring him, Klein walked to the depths of the hall. There was a grayish-white stone staircase descending with a huge stone monument erected at the entrance. At the top of the stone monument stood a long and slender statue that resembled a giant bird made of bronze. Its wings had all kinds of pale white symbols. Under the bronze bird-shaped statue, the surface of the stone monument was written in text that originated from the language of the dead. Their shapes were all different, looking like simplified birds or coiled snakes that looked different. They formed a few indistinct words: even deities cannot escape, imprisonment even in death. Is this a warning to all living beings who come to Calderon City to not go down the stairs? It directly leads to the river of eternal darkness. Klein's thoughts raced as he carefully read the words on the stone monument. From his point of view, this meant that, even if a sequence zero true deity were to approach the river of eternal darkness, they would be trapped there and unable to escape. And even if they were to die, they would still be imprisoned by this abstract river, this Sephira. Although they wouldn't dissipate, they wouldn't be able to escape. From the looks of it, it's just like the Chaos Sea. Without any Sephira protection, merely approaching the river of eternal darkness will result in a terrifying mutation. Klein retracted his gaze and tidied up the golden bird-shaped accessory attached to his breast pocket. He walked past the bronze statue's stone monument and walked down the grayish-white staircase. He didn't steal the distance again, to prevent himself from slamming head first into danger. In the dark, silent, and cold environment, the golden bird-shaped accessory in front of Klein's chest released a pale white glow, illuminating a small area. It was like a tiny lifeboat struggling in the waves of death. After descending for an unknown period of time, the aura of Sephira Castle around him expanded out of reflex and became extremely thick, like a grayish-white cocoon. At the same time, Klein turned his head slightly and heard a faint, illusory whooshing sound. This seemed to indicate that a dark river was slowly flowing deep underground not far from him. In the next second, Klein looked down at his feet. At some point in time, there was a dark stream of incorporeal water surging out from somewhere. Even light couldn't exist on its surface. This is different from what I saw last time. Klein frowned slightly. Back when he came to Calderon City to hunt the Spirit World Plunderer, he had caused a certain change, causing large amounts of grayish-white illusory tidal water to surge up the bottom of the pit. The colors that he saw the two times were completely different. Just as Klein's thoughts raced, at the bottom of the stone staircase, where the dark tide surged over, a thin grayish-white fog spread up. Together with the illusory liquid, it expanded into a grayish-white liquid that was more mist-like. When the water reached Klein's feet, it silently shrank back as though it was constantly ebbing up and down at a particular frequency. This faint gray fog is a little familiar. Klein's expression turned solemn. After pausing for a few seconds, he continued down. This time, the rising illusory tide drowned him, causing his body to turn light, causing his emotions to quickly turn cold and his thoughts to gradually weaken. If not for the protection of Sephira Castle's aura around him, Klein suspected that he would passively fuse with the tide without being able to resist. Following that, the grayish-white cocoon rose and bobbed up and down in the water before slowly reaching the end of the staircase. At the end was a void. Amidst the emptiness flowed a straight, wide, illusory, colorless, dark river. This river was so blurry that it was difficult to see it clearly. This was because its surroundings were covered with a swath of grayish-white like a thin layer of fog. Indeed, Klein couldn't help but mutter when he saw this. He was no stranger to this kind of fog. He had seen it behind the door in Bansi's ruins before. He had seen it at the easternmost end of the Forsaken Land of the Gods before, as well as beneath Sephira Castle. And unlike other places, there was a portion of the water from the River of Eternal Darkness that penetrated the grayish-white fog and fused to some extent with the latter, changing colors between dark black and pale white. The river water here kept swirling up before falling down, like a stream that was running through the illusory darkness. On both sides of the distributary stood huge and pale white stone pillars. They seemed to be supporting something, preventing whatever it was from collapsing. At this moment, between the stone pillars, and on the banks of the distributary, countless blurry, translucent figures were pacing back and forth, slowly but unceasingly. Among them, the most eye-catching one was a seemingly lost figure that would occasionally enter into the depths of the distributary before turning around. Yet, it didn't seem like it could leave the river. It was huge, similar to the stone pillars around it. It had a heavy black robe draped over it, and from its side profile, it looked very old. Suddenly, it turned its head and looked at Klein. Its face had obvious southern continent characteristics, but it had already rotted while white feathers stained with pale yellow oil grew out. Klein knew him, and he was Mr. Azek's father, the Death of the Fourth Epoch, Emperor of the Underworld Salinger. Death Salinger, who was pacing around the River of Eternal Darkness, looked at Klein, who was enveloped in the grayish-white cocoon. His eyes that had pale white flames that were about to be extinguished instantly reflected the golden bird-shaped accessory on Klein's chest. In the next second, a deep roar came from his rotting mouth, reverberating above the river, causing the entirety of Calderon City to visibly shake. The distributary that occasionally rose up or plunged down, sometimes dark and sometimes pale white, reached the end of the stone staircase with the rising of tides, surging towards Klein. During this process, the illusory tide fused with the grayish-white fog, creating a similar color. The grayish-white torrent slammed into Klein's body repeatedly, but it failed to destroy the cocoon around him. Death Salinger's rotting body took steps to the edge of the distributary, but he couldn't escape no matter what. All he could do was stand there and roar wildly. Klein's gaze swept past him, as he looked at the blurry figures loitering around the banks. One of them had already been swept to the center of the distributary by the surging tide. They couldn't help but sink to the bottom of the river, melting like ice. The remaining ones didn't show any fear as they maintained their blank and lost state, moving back and forth endlessly. At a glance, Klein saw many familiar figures. They were the same person, Azek Eggers, with his bronze skin and soft facial features. This death consul seemed to have dissociated into multiple selves. They constantly paced between the pale white stone pillars on both sides of the River of Eternal Darkness. As Klein's heart stirred, his right leg suddenly turned cold. He subconsciously lowered his head and saw a pale white hand. The palm penetrated the grayish-white cocoon and grabbed his calf. And the owner of the palm floated in the surging torrent was like a water ghost as it attempted to pull Klein into the depths of the water. Its attack could actually ignore the aura of Sephira Castle. Sensing Klein's gaze, the pale white palm's owner raised his head to reveal his face. He had black hair and brown eyes. His facial features were ordinary and he had a scholarly air. Klein Moretti. The water ghost was Klein Moretti. In the next second, Klein's left leg, right shoulder, and left arm were grabbed by different pale white hands. This made him feel cold all over as his spirit body seemed to freeze. He couldn't even use all his Beyonder powers. It was impossible to resist. The three pale white hands belonged to different blurry figures, while the different blurry figures all had the same face, Klein Moretti's face. Under the pull of the four water ghosts, Klein's body gradually separated from the grayish-white cocoon and sank into the torrent. His body became colder and colder, and his thoughts gradually fell into silence. His vision gradually darkened, and eventually, there were only dark ebbing waves. Above the gray fog, in the ancient palace, Klein's consciousness returned to his original body. Then, without any hesitation, he extended his palm and used the power of Sephira Castle to steal an item from the latter through his connection with the historical projection. A golden beam of light flashed as Klein held the golden bird-shaped accessory. At the same time, he stopped maintaining the historical void projection. The drowning figure disappeared from the eternal night flood. It can ignore the aura of Sephira Castle, which means that those four figures truly are me. But why would I be trapped in the stream of the river of eternal darkness, pacing about endlessly? Four figures, four figures. Klein's expression was solemn as he gently tapped the edge of the long mottled table. He gained some inspiration amidst the tapping. The words, four, souls, and death, corresponded to the reality that he had died 4 times and had revived 4 times. Of course, after becoming an attendant of mysteries, the 4 resurrection opportunities had been reset again. Every time I die, regardless of whether I successfully revive or not, I will leave an imprint in the river of eternal darkness. I died 4 times, so there are 4 figures wandering the banks of the river of eternal darkness. Klein roughly grasped the crux of it before he sighed inwardly. The river of eternal darkness is indeed a Sephira. As expected of the symbol of death, repose, destination, endpoint, and darkness. This is what the goddess meant when she pointed out that I'll encounter a different kind of danger. When the historical projection was drowned, I suffered some mental damage. If my mental state was unstable, I might have suffered some terrible consequences by now. Based on this deduction, Klein had a brand new understanding of the many Azek figures and the wandering Death Salinger. They were the corresponding imprints of death. Mr. Azek has indeed died many times in the process of searching for his memories, but he comes back to life every time. According to the present situation, although an undying doesn't die, it leaves behind a lot of hidden dangers. Once the number of deaths reaches a certain level, their true bodies might be attracted to the river of eternal darkness one day, ending up as one of the figures that wander around there for an eternity. Only Salinger's figure is there. This means that, after accommodating the uniqueness, his death imprint also becomes unique. As Klein's thoughts raced through his mind, he became worried about Mr. Azek's state of survival. And there were 2 solutions to resolving this problem. One was to make Azek's soul whole and make him stop repeating his resurrection process. And second, to help the Evernite goddess become a great old one and gain control of the river of eternal darkness. Hey, perhaps this is another binary choice. When the goddess becomes a great old one, there's no need for her to make use of half of Mr. Azek's soul again. Klein reined in his thoughts and focused his attention on his goal. He had entered the depths of Calderon City, not to resolve the death imprint of Death Salinger, and destroy any chances of him reviving. Instead, he was here to retrieve the river water from the river of eternal darkness. Clearly, the illusory tide's water that flows out of the river doesn't work. It's only an aura that flows out, not the river water itself. Also, water that has fused with the grayish-white fog won't do either. It's not pure enough, so it wouldn't be able to accomplish the desired effect. From the looks of it, only when the distributary turns back into its deep and dark state can I get the water. Hey, there's definitely no way to get it from the main river. That grayish-white fog is definitely a solid barrier. Klein quickly formulated a plan based on his analysis. That was to avoid going close to the river of eternal darkness, and not attract the attention of Death Salinger. He would wait for the distributary's water to recede and turn dark before he headed over, before allowing his 4 death imprints to drag his historical projection to the bottom of the river. During this process, the historical projection would seize the opportunity and use the golden, bird-shaped accessory to scoop the river water. Then, he would return his consciousness back to Sephira Castle. Using the powers of theft, as well as the close connection between the 2 items, he could take away the golden, bird-shaped accessory. After considering the finer details to the procedure, Klein returned to Calderon City and summoned his historical void projection. He repeated the previous process and soon returned to the stone tablet next to the giant bronze bird statue. He walked down the grayish-white stone steps, step by step. The aura of Sephira Castle around him gradually thickened, turning into a thin cocoon. It didn't take long before Klein arrived at the end of the staircase. He saw the river of eternal darkness flowing in the void, the pale white columns on both banks, and the countless blurry figures that lingered at the banks of the distributary. This time, he wasn't in a hurry to go forward. He left the staircase and waited patiently at the same spot for the distributary's water to recede. The grayish-white colors faded and the water darkened. Right now, Klein's figure flashed as he stole the distance and appeared in Death Salinger's blind spot. Without any surprise, as his body sank into the river of eternal darkness, the pale white hands immediately penetrated the aura of Sephira Castle and grabbed his limbs. His 4 death imprints appeared around him, eager to drag him to the bottom of the river. Klein's head submerged under the dark river water, making his body turn cold as his thoughts turned still. Before he completely lost his senses, transparent and distorted maggots crawled out from Klein's neck. They quickly crawled to the side of the golden, bird-shaped accessory, clustered around it, and lifted it up, preparing to scoop the water of the river of eternal darkness. At that moment, a massive shadow appeared in the swirling illusory river in front of Klein. It was a giant bird floating in the water, one that was completely submerged by the river of eternal darkness's distributary. The giant bird's surface was covered with white flames, and the feathers formed from mysterious patterns, but most of them had been melted away by the river of eternal darkness. The exposed parts were pitch black and rotten with pale yellow pus on the surface. The giant bird's eyes seemed to be made of bronze, and layers of illusory doors were hidden within. Phoenix ancestor Gregrace, the ancient death who had opened up the underworld. In front of Gregrace's eyes, a bronze beam burst out, enveloping the golden, bird-shaped accessory and Klein's historical projection in a bid to drag them over together. After weighing his current situation, Klein instantly made a decision and gave up the attempt of scooping the river water. His consciousness immediately returned to Sephira Castle, and he stole the golden, bird-shaped accessory. His historical projection dissipated. There's danger in the water too. The ancient god, Phoenix ancestor Gregrace, has completely sunk into the river of eternal darkness. If the goddess can truly accommodate the uniqueness of the death pathway, and if Salinger can't use that opportunity to revive in his body, he should also sink into the water like Gregrace. And the death imprint of Gregrace will melt further. Klein silently sighed as he modified the plan. Following that, he summoned the historical void projection and returned to the end of the stairs. After waiting for a while, when Death Salinger turned around and slowly walked towards the bank, Klein suddenly stole the distance and appeared in front of him. In the next second, Salinger let out a low growl, rapidly increasing the flow of the distributary. At the same time, Klein was grabbed by his death imprints, and forcefully dragged to the bottom of the river. He sensed the Phoenix ancestor, Gregrace. Like before, Gregrace's bronze eyes lit up. However, what enveloped this light wasn't Klein and the golden, bird-shaped accessory, but Death Salinger. Grafting. Seizing this brief opportunity, the worms of spirit crawled out from Klein's historical projection and lifted the golden, bird-shaped accessory. The bronze eye of the accessory also released a beam of light, scooping up a tiny portion of the river water. In the next moment, Klein's consciousness returned to Sephira Castle. He raised his hand and retrieved the accessory. Phew, I'm finally done. Looking at the golden, bird-shaped accessory in his hand, he slowly exhaled. As the owner of Sephira Castle, this mission wasn't too difficult. As long as he didn't rashly enter with his main body, he could rely on repeated failures to accumulate experience and figure out the situation. And if it wasn't for the fact that there were 2 deaths in the distributary of the river of eternal darkness, one wandering and the other sinking, Klein wouldn't have failed twice. After weighing the bird-shaped, golden accessory in his hand, Klein quickly returned to the real world. He casually picked an empty plot of land and set up an altar to hold a sacrificial ritual. With regards to the other secrets hidden in Calderon City, as well as the loitering figures around the River of Eternal Darkness, he temporarily didn't have any thoughts of starting a deeper exploration of it. This was because he still had more important matters to prepare for. He also had a key question to ask the Evernite goddess. Soon, he held the ritual and allowed the candlelight and spirituality materials to fuse together, forming a door of sacrifice and bestowment. Without any hesitation, Klein placed the bird-shaped, golden accessory into the wind, allowing it to slowly pass through the mysterious door and vanish into the endless darkness. In the next second, he sharply noticed that he had been dragged into a dream. In the center of the dreamscape was a Gothic palace that seemed to blend with the darkness around it. Its details were exquisite, its color dim, but it was still gorgeous. Klein passed through bushes of night vanilla and slumber flowers before stepping into the palace. In the deepest part of the hall, the Evernite goddess was sitting on an ancient high-back chair. She was still wearing the layered black dress that didn't seem complicated. The sparkling spots on the dress reflected the dome and the walls, and the pillars of the palace created a quiet and dreamy starry sky. The Evernite goddess, whose face seemed to be covered in layers of fishnet veils, held the bird-shaped, golden accessory and slowly stood up. She walked down the stairs to Klein. Her voice sounding like a lullaby. "What do you have to ask?" Klein politely took off his top hat and bowed slightly. "I want to know if the grayish-white fog that envelops the River of Eternal Darkness has something to do with that Lord of the Mysteries. That was also the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings." Although he couldn't see the Evernite goddess's face clearly, Klein felt like she was smiling when he looked straight at her. Yes. Furthermore, not only is the River of Eternal Darkness enveloped by the grayish-white fog, but the city behind Bansi Harbor, and the entire western continent is enveloped by the same grayish-white fog. Klein hesitated for a moment before saying, "This is a kind of seal." The Evernite goddess's dream projection nodded. "That's right. Apart from Sephira Castle and the Chaos Sea, all the other Sephira were sealed in the western continent by that mysterious Lord of the Mysteries. River of Eternal Darkness, Brood Hive, City of Calamity, Tenebrous World, Nation of Disorder, Knowledge More, and Key of Light have all been sealed in the western continent by the celestial worthy. Isn't this too much? What pomp! It's no wonder that the city behind Bansi Harbor's door is like the former Shanghai. This is the City of Calamity affecting that city in the real world, as well as Bansi. Then, to a certain extent, it has caused certain changes." Klein was enlightened and amazed. Back when he saw the scene behind the door in Bansi, he had suspected that it had something to do with the western continent. Furthermore, according to the clue that Bansi was the headquarters of Red Angel Medici's family, he suspected that behind the door was the reflection of the Sephira, the City of Calamity. After a moment of silence, Klein didn't conceal his feelings. He sighed and said, "The power of that Lord of the Mysteries far exceeds my imagination. How could such a great old one, who is known as one of the pillars of the universe, silently perish?" The Evernite goddess's dream projection shook her head. It wasn't silent. From the clues that were available, he died together with the God Almighty of ancient times. That God Almighty's corpse formed the first blasphemy slate in the Chaos Sea. And beside it was the uniqueness of the Marauder pathway. In other words, in the middle of the first epoch, the Lord of the Mysteries and God Almighty had a battle that was abnormally intense but didn't cause much of a stir. In the end, both perished. This can explain why the ancient sun god had the uniqueness or erased uniqueness of the Marauder pathway when he walked out of the Chaos Sea. It was ripped off by the ancient God Almighty from the Lord of the Mysteries. Amidst his thoughts, Klein asked in puzzlement, why would they want to kill each other? They are both pillars and aren't from similar pathways. There shouldn't be any life and death conflicts that cannot be resolved. The Evernite goddess's dream projection said gently, convergence is an instinct. The higher the level, the stronger the instinct. That Lord of the Mysteries and God Almighty of ancient times were unable to restrain themselves from converging together, becoming the embodiment of the entire universe, which is also the innate instinct of the original creator. The crazier one becomes the stronger they become. And beyond cunning, powerful, terrifying, and filled with wisdom, there's such a side to the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. Klein thought for a moment and said, that Lord of the Mysteries and God Almighty of ancient times are, in essence, different sides of the original creator. The Evernite goddess's dream projection said in a comforting voice, using the same existence but different personas as an analogy will be more accurate. The original creator was the maker of the universe, and also its destroyer. It is both day and also night. It's the light of holiness, and also the decadent abyss. It is an amalgamation of all contradicting concepts and symbolism. That's why he naturally has a tendency to be dissociative in a way that cannot be controlled. Once he splits, there will be a strong trend towards convergence. In a time more ancient than the era we lived in our past lives, the original sleeping creator had naturally split into multiple personas. They were also in a state of slumber, but they began to use the authority and beyond the characteristics they controlled to influence the world, making many preparations for the true dissociation when the original creator awakened. Here, the most powerful and active ones were God Almighty and the Lord of the Mysteries. The latter had another honorific name in the Western continent. In the early mid-stages of the First Epoch, they should have used different methods to grasp the additional Sephirot. This made the inclination to converge more intense, making it impossible for them to control themselves, and began taking actions against each other. According to the ancient sun gods' research, the pillar of support is the highest level of stability one can achieve. If a great old one exceeds this limit, just accommodating an additional Sephirah will lead to being controlled by the convergence instinct in an irreversible manner. No one knows the exact situation of the battle. Even the seven lights of the spirit world do not know. We only know that, from that fateful moment onwards, the two great old ones known as the pillars vanished completely. As for the other Sephirah other than the Chaos Sea and Sephirah Castle, they were sealed by Sephirah Castle's powers in the Western continent. That was once the territory ruled by the Lord of the Mysteries. This setup led to a problem. It was that, before the reappearance of the Lord of the Mysteries and God Almighty, and before removal and breaking of the Western continent's seal, no sequence zero in this world could become a great old one to resist the outer deities. As the apocalypse approaches, this problem will force all the true deities to nurture a Lord of the Mysteries or God Almighty. And the former Lord of the Mysteries and God Almighty are very likely to awaken in the bodies. This, therefore, the sealing of the other Sephiros was done deliberately by the celestial worthy, preventing the later sequence zero true deities from deliberately avoiding this pathway, killing the chances of the birth of a new Lord of the Mysteries. And as long as a new Lord of the Mysteries is born, he has a high chance of being revived and completely awakening. Isn't this too sinister? From a certain point of view, there's no need to be afraid of others knowing this arrangement. The more entities that know of it, the more they will be inclined to quickly support the growth of a Lord of the Mysteries, so as to prevent them from only having a few years towards the end to gain control of the corresponding Sephirah. The more Klein thought about it, the more terrifying the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings appeared. This made him sigh inwardly. As expected of a pillar that can make the genie fall into such a predicament to this day. Klein immediately asked, then why didn't you support the growth of a Lord of the Mysteries in the Fourth Epoch? He actually knew the answer to this question. As time passed, as the original creator's different personas, the celestial worthy and God Almighty will have their wills constantly weaken. The closer they got to the apocalypse, the weaker the corresponding will became. This made those of the future be able to resist and suppress them, and avoid losing themselves. This could be proven by the fact that Adam had waited until recently to advance to visionary. The Evonite goddess's dream projection revealed a smile. Back then, Ammon and Bethel were unwilling. All of them wished to make all sorts of preparations, hoping to make the attempt when the apocalypse was approaching. As for Salinger, he planned to use the river of eternal darkness to fuse with the Red Priest's uniqueness to create a brand new Great Old One path. Then, he went mad. He wasn't able to resist the desire for converging the Twilight and Evonite pathway. Death was also forced into such circumstances. On the one hand, the apocalypse was only 1,000 years or so away, and on the other hand, the river of eternal darkness had been sealed by the celestial worthy, a pillar. This prevented him from attempting to control it. It's too sinister, too much. Klein couldn't help but inwardly criticize the celestial worthy. At this moment, the Evonite goddess's dream projection continued. The seal on the Western continent is gradually weakening with time. The Sephirah will instinctively or consciously use their symbolism to corrode the uniqueness and high sequence beyond the characteristics that land on them to influence the outside world. The first to seep out energy was the river of eternal darkness. In the Second Epoch, it formed a distributary through Greggrace. After that, in the Fourth Epoch, traces of more Sephirah began to appear on the northern and southern continents and the islands over the five seas. This is an important factor hidden behind many of the anomalies in the Fourth Epoch. The Sephiro had indirectly exacted their influence through the seal in the Fourth Epoch. It's no wonder Adams said that my understanding of the Fourth Epoch's history isn't deep enough. From the looks of it, Bansi Harbor retained the elven customs not because it was an elven settlement, but also because of other factors. Klein thought for a few seconds before smiling. I roughly understand. Is that why you've been helping me all this while? Report chapter. The Evernite goddess's dream projection replied with a smile, if it's just to nurture a Lord of the Mysteries, I should be betting on Aemon. At the very least, the chances of him succeeding is much higher than yours. Without waiting for Klein to ask any further, she continued with a voice as ethereal as a dream. The era that was buried in the past is a memory shared between us, and also the critical period in which our humanity was born, sprouted, and nourished. Even if I've had a long life, it still remains my fondest of memories. You have its imprint in you, so I'm more willing to help you. The love for the house extends even to the crows perching on its roof. Klein made a conclusion in the form of an idiom. At that moment, he recalled the words Emperor Roselle had written in his diary, home. In his wistful silence, the dream projection of the Evernite goddess switched to saying, when you're ready, you can go to the main peak of the Hornachus mountain range anytime. Of course, it's your freedom to choose. No one will force you, and no one can force you either. You can choose to stop at a certain stage and not become a great old one, nor allow the Lord of the Mysteries to awaken in your body. Then, at the last moment of the apocalypse, you can bring the people and objects you want to protect and wander to other planets in other solar systems to avoid the attention of the outer deities, and create another civilization. Klein had long thought of this problem. After a moment of silence, he said, I'm not sure if Roselle had said one thing, you can hide for a moment, but you can't hide forever. He was speaking in Jotun with the Evernite goddess, so it was a little odd when translating the proverb. Escaping was just a temporary strategy. It couldn't be used as a long-term plan. After a pause, Klein continued, although the universe is vast and without an end, the outer deities are clearly more familiar with it than we are. They're also stronger, directly representing a certain aspect of the universe. It's very difficult to avoid the pursuit. Besides, even if we succeed, peace will only last for some time. The recreated civilization will be destroyed in less than 1,000 years. When that happens, we won't even have the chance to become great old ones, never capable of any form of self-redemption. This was because if one wanted to successfully escape during the invasion of the outer deities, they had to give up all the Sephiro. Otherwise, they would definitely become the focus of the attention. Let alone wandering the cosmos, even withstanding the first wave of attacks was an unknown. The Evernite goddess's dream projection spoke slowly, apart from the items ripped from the outer deities, only taking away the uniquenesses and high sequence beyond the characteristics of the other pathways might not necessarily garner the attention of the outer deities. They wouldn't spend too much time searching. You also said that it's not necessarily the case. The outer deities should still have a certain desire for the uniqueness and high sequence beyond the characteristics of similar pathways. This can help them approach the level of a pillar, Klein replied calmly. We can't place our hopes on the feelings. They aren't benevolent. The Evernite goddess's dream projection nodded and said, in this aspect, you're more aware than Roselle. Of course, it's because he had learned of the great old ones and the outer deities a little too late. She continued, you have another choice, use Pathles's method to personally lower your level and let Aemon steal Sephira Castle. This way, you can live well as a Sequence 1 angel. You don't have to constantly worry that the Lord of the Mysteries will awaken in you. It won't be that exhausting. In the Church of Evernight's Bible, there was the division of angels and archangels. Klein had always guessed that the latter referred to Sequence 1, and today, he had finally obtained confirmation. Of course, this was only the standard of one church, not necessarily the rest. After hearing the Evernite goddess's words, Klein fell silent for a long time before asking, can Aemon be trusted? The Evernite goddess's dream projection said frankly, I can't give you a definite answer. Klein asked again, if the Lord of the Mysteries awakens in Aemon's body, will he take back all the high sequence beyond the characteristics of the seer, marauder, and apprentice pathways? I don't know, the Evernite goddess's dream projection replied in the same tone. Klein fell silent again. After a while, he said, personally, I don't wish to become a great old one, but I can't let down and betray those existences who have placed the bets on me. They have more or less helped me. Once Amen becomes the Lord of the Mysteries, he will definitely help the ancient sun god retrieve the uniqueness and sequence one beyond a characteristic from the Lord of Storms and the God of Knowledge and Wisdom, causing the deaths. Besides, Amen is a reckless god. The Evernite goddess's dream projection nodded slightly and said, "Your humanity has been maintained well." After making up his mind, Klein freed himself from his low spirit state. He smiled and said, "If I hadn't maintained my humanity, and allowed the godhood to gain an advantage, I would have also made a similar choice. That's because a godhood's instinct is convergence upon oneself." The Evernite goddess's dream projection gently chuckled. "Make your preparations. Meet Antigonus as soon as possible." Klein nodded and suddenly recalled something. He hurriedly asked, "Has Amen already used Mr. Dawes' ritual to accommodate the uniqueness of the apprentice pathway?" The Evernite goddess's dream projection slowly replied, "If it were another existence, then definitely not. But if it's Amen, there's a 50% chance. He likes to take risks and seek thrills." Klein didn't say another word as he watched the Evernite goddess's projection vanish before him as the dream gently collapsed. The altar that he had yet to clear occupied his vision again. To him, heading to the main peak of the Hornachus mountain range to face the Antigonus family's ancestor didn't require much preparation from him. He would mainly rely on Sephira Castle to produce an avatar to steal the attendant of mysteries beyond a characteristic, the one from Zaratul, that he hadn't digested yet, allowing his main body to be in a unique state that could accommodate the uniqueness. As his mental state stabilized, even without Zaratul's remnant mental imprint, Klein could still rely on his humanity, consciousness, and anchors to barely suppress the partial consciousness of the celestial worthy. However, before that, Klein's spiritual intuition told him that he needed to do something. After looking around, he tidied up the altar and dragged Dwayne Dantes out of the fog of history. Sitting at the table, Klein spread out a piece of paper and wrote a letter to Mr. Azek. As it hadn't been a while since he wrote the previous letter, there wasn't much content. He only mentioned the river of eternal darkness that was situated underground in Calderon City, as well as the death imprints on both banks of the distributary. He emphasized the numerous Azek eggers he had seen, and his guesses. After folding the letter, Klein took out Azek's copper whistle and blew at it. The skeleton messenger appeared at the size of a normal human. It knelt down on one knee and opened its palm. After Klein handed the letter to it, he took out a gold coin from Sephira Castle. "This is to thank you for all the work you've done. If you can't accept it, hand it to your master and let him decide." This gold coin was one of the transformed gold coins that had been tainted by the aura of Sephira Castle. He had already used one of them to pay Miss Messenger's fee, and he had lost one to marriage when they played cards. The skeleton messenger was stunned for nearly 5 seconds, but he didn't dare disobey Klein's words. He clasped the letter and the gold coin with his bony fingers. It disintegrated and fell to the ground like a waterfall before drilling into the ground. Following that, Klein took out another gold coin and placed it in his pocket. At the same time, he made the Worms of Spirit on duty in Sephira Castle to take a look at a certain crimson star. East Balam, in a cathedral belonging to the Evernite goddess. As the first batch of demigods participating in the besieging of the Rose School of Thought, Leonard Mitchell had already used a sealed artifact to reach the southern continent. However, he had no progress for the time being. This was because the Rose School of Thought demigods seemed to sense the danger in the air as they simultaneously hid themselves. This made Leonard have no choice but to wait patiently, ready to answer the call of any dispatches. While he had nothing to do, he wore his red glove and entered the cathedral's prayer hall. He did his daily prayer in a rather devout manner. In the dark and serene environment, he seemed to fall asleep. After an unknown period of time, Leonard opened his eyes and stood up. He walked down the aisle towards the door. At that moment, he saw a familiar figure. It was Klein Moretti, wearing a top hat and formal suit with black hair and brown eyes. Leonard's pupils dilated as his brows pricked up. Klein, who was also praying, lowered his hands and stood up. He walked past him and slowly approached the altar. During this process, neither of them spoke, as if the other party was just a stranger. After reaching the donation box near the altar, Klein took out a gold coin from his pocket and threw it in with a serious expression. Then, he changed direction and left the cathedral from another door. Leonard stood in the middle of the aisle and watched this scene with a puzzled look. He frowned slightly. At this moment, in his mind, Palais Zoroast's slightly aged voice echoed, "Find a chance to get that gold coin." Ellipsis. Backland, in a particular house. Will Orsepton held a silver spoon and focused on digging at the pale green ice cream in front of him. Suddenly, he extended his left hand to block the side of the food. On the chair beside him, Dwayne Dantes's figure instantly appeared. "I seem to have missed your birthday twice," Klein said with a smile. "This is a belated present." As he spoke, he took out a gold coin and pushed it to Will Orsepton. "This is a lucky gold coin for you." Will was stunned for 2 seconds before muttering, "The gift celebrating my birth was a lucky amulet. For a birthday gift, it's a lucky gold coin. You really don't have any creativity." As he spoke, he reached out his chubby hand and quickly took the gold coin. Klein smiled, stood up, and vanished. Byam, inside the Church of the Sea God. After the Mass, Alger Wilson returned to his room and saw a figure appear by the window. It was Gairman Sparrow in a top hat and trench coat. Without waiting for Alger to speak, Klein took 2 steps forward and solemnly said, "I have come under Mr. Fool's orders." He habitually acted as the attendant of mysteries. Alger immediately lowered his head and pressed his right hand to his left chest. "Praise Mr. Fool." Klein nodded slightly and took out an item from the junk pile of Sephira Castle. Alger's eyes immediately reflected a short scepter made of bones. The tip of the scepter was embedded with tiny blue gems. A small number of them were dyed black, and a small number was covered in the light of dawn. Around it were countless pure points of light, and the sounds of illusory prayers emitted from it, stacked and holy. Alger's eyes widened as he couldn't help but reveal a hint of greed. As a Sequence 4 demigod of the Sailor Pathway, he was extremely certain that the white bone scepter before him was the symbol of the sea god's identity, level, and strength. As he endured the slight dizziness from the prayers, he cast his gaze at the world Gairman Sparrow, waiting for the deity's attendant to speak. Klein raised the sea god's scepter with one hand and said with a solemn expression, "This is Mr. Fool's gift and a sign of trust, as well as a reward for protecting a large number of believers. No matter what happens in the future, you are to keep following Mr. Fool's instructions and do your best to complete the missions he gives." Alger acutely sensed the hidden meaning. He suspected that Mr. Fool would encounter something in the future, causing him to suffer injuries or enter a nadir state. At the thought that he had already left the Church of Storms and had no way out, Alger pressed his right hand to his left chest and replied loudly, "My faith lies only with Mr. Fool." Upon seeing this, Klein secretly nodded before repeating what he had said to Miss Justice and Miss Judgment. This made Alger heave a sigh of relief. After all, knowing what might happen in the future was better than not knowing anything. Without hesitation, he repeated his words in a serious tone. Klein handed the sea god's scepter to him. "You should get used to this sealed artifact and the daily life as a sea god. Once you finish digesting the cataclysmic Intera potion, use it to concoct the potion. The prior acting will reduce the difficulty of advancing." In fact, Klein could now remove the grafting and transfer the concept of sea god, which was directed at him and Sephira Castle, to Alger, allowing him to directly become half a sea god. It would allow him to better adapt to his identity and better act in advance. However, considering how he was about to accommodate the Fool's uniqueness, he needed sufficient anchors to balance the consciousness of the celestial worthies awakening. He couldn't be missing the sea god's believers. Klein decided to wait until his condition had stabilized before completely transferring everything that was related to sea god. Currently, Alger was an attendant more suitable to wield the authority, helping the deity listen and respond to prayer without enjoying the corresponding anchors and identity. The sea god scepter's owner was still Klein, as everything still pointed at him. This was the miraculous use of grafting. Alger suppressed his excitement and joy as he answered Gairman Sparrow sincerely and received the sea god scepter. Then, he deliberated and asked, "What negative effects does this sealed artifact have?" "Mr. Fool has already applied certain seals to it. The negative effects of the sea god's scepter have been greatly reduced," Klein said simply. "It will only make the wielder more irritable and cause the spirit to be in a certain state of chaos. In addition, it will drain the blood of the surrounding creatures every month. You can fly to the sea or an uninhabited island ahead of time. That's still manageable." Alger secretly heaved a sigh of relief before asking what beyonder powers the scepter had. After Klein briefly described it, he vanished. In the ancient palace above the fog. After finishing the additional preparations, Klein sat on the Fool's chair and conjured a piece of goatskin and a dark red fountain pen. He began analyzing the possible developments at the main peak of the Hornachus mountain range when he faced the Antigonus family's ancestor. If everything goes smoothly, and I enter the final stage of accommodating the Fool's uniqueness, the goddess will definitely have to remove the concealment. This is because this is the only way to allow the region to interact with reality, allowing fate to connect, thus achieving the effect of fooling fate. From Mr. Dawes' apotheosis ritual, the commotion caused by accommodating a uniqueness is definitely not trivial. Once it's not concealed, this matter will definitely be detected by the other deities. Furthermore, those who are concerned about this matter must have been watching the main peak of the Hornachus mountain range recently. Once there are any changes there, they will immediately know. In such a situation, there's no doubt that there will be interference, destruction, assistance, and support. It's very important to find out who the foes and allies are. Otherwise, there's no way to make targeted preparations. The goddess is definitely on my side. If she were an enemy, I would have been concealed countless times. It's impossible for me to grow to this level. To put it simply, she had many opportunities to sell me out. Furthermore, she could sell it at a very good price previously. Furthermore, to her, it wouldn't affect her ability to support who becomes the Lord of the Mysteries. That's why she can make a decision based on her preferences. Adam is currently unable to bypass the seal and obtain the River of Eternal Darkness. The ones who do not wish for Amen to become the Lord of the Mysteries, the most are the Eternal Blazing Sun, the Lord of Storms, and the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. Once someone attempts to destroy my ritual to accommodate the Fool's uniqueness, they would definitely help me and directly provide help. Apart from these four true deities, the remaining sequence zeros are Visionary Adam and the true creator Amen's father. The probability of helping him is definitely higher than them being on the sidelines. Earth Mother has placed a bet on me through Emlyn, but it's not necessarily the case that she would definitely help me at the critical moment. To her, waiting patiently for the outcome when there are no interests at play is the best choice. The primordial demoness's condition is odd. It's possible for her to make any choice. The attitude of the god of steam and machinery is ambiguous. It's more likely for him to remain neutral or privately make a deal with Amen and Adam. I don't have any chips to move him. Other than these true deities, there are some uncommon sequence zeros or the consciousnesses in existence that are nearly at sequence zero. The Lord of the Abyss, also known as the Dark Side of the Universe, is suspected to have been invaded by the Mother Tree of Desire. He would occasionally respond to the prayers of the Blood Sanctify sect. It has been a long time since he exerted any influence on the real world. Likewise, the Chained God is in a similar situation. What they will do will only depend on the Mother Tree of Desire's thoughts. And to the outer deities, delaying the birth of a Lord of the Mysteries should be a consensus. Under such circumstances, stopping me from being able to accommodate the Fool's uniqueness will only cause me to be at an absolute disadvantage in the competition with Amen, allowing the competition to quickly determine a winner. The most plausible strategy of the Mother Tree of Desire is tacit consent. She might even help me to accommodate the Fool's uniqueness, preventing the scale between me and Amen from tilting. After that, she will repeatedly destroy our inclinations and attempts to converge, delaying the birth of the Lord of the Mysteries to the apocalypse. The Red Angel evil spirit definitely hasn't recovered to the level where he can be involved in such matters. The hidden sage is very mysterious, making it difficult to guess his thoughts, but he should know that I am hostile towards him. At this point in the analysis, Klein made a conclusion: allies, the Evernite goddess, Lord of Storms, Eternal Blazing Sun, and the God of Knowledge and Wisdom; foes, Visionary Adam, True Creator, and Mr. Error Amen. Neutral with tendencies to support me, Earth Mother, Dark Side of the Universe, and Chained God. Neutral with tendencies to support Amen, Hidden Sage. Neutral and ambiguous attitudes, Primordial Demoness, God of Steam and Machinery. Yes, I'll ignore how far Adam and the True Creator have fused. I'll consider the worst-case scenario. I'll treat them as the ancient Sun God and treat them as a dual pathway sequence zero true God. The goddess has the uniqueness of the Twilight Giant and Death. Although she hasn't accommodated them, she has some level of control of them using that bird-shaped, golden accessory as a medium. Even if she can't compare to the ancient Sun God, she can definitely stall him. I'll also consider Amen as a dual pathways sequence zero true God. At least two of the Lord of Storms trio have to be diverted to have a chance to fend him off. From the surface, I still hold a certain advantage. Klein looked at the content listed on the piece of paper as he thought silently. However, this advantage didn't consider the neutral factions. Klein tapped the edge of the long mottled table and considered the worst situation. The primordial demoness, hidden sage, and god of steam and machinery might all choose to help Aemon based on their own secret dealings or their morality. This way, even if Earth Mother participated in the battle, Klein's side would be at a disadvantage. The god of steam and machinery and the other god from the omnipotent and omniscient pathway would cancel out each other. The primordial demoness would hold back the Earth Mother, who had just taken back the uniqueness of the moon. The hidden sage would face the universe's dark side and the chained god, which were controlled by the Mother Tree of Desire. The powers that the outer deities could sneak into the world were extremely limited. This gave the hidden sage a likely advantage. Furthermore, this cancellation was a calculation based on ideal conditions. In reality, under the chaotic situation, Aemon, who was in charge of the authority, could play many tricks. It was possible that he would be able to find weaknesses in an instant and bypass the obstacles, causing Klein's ritual to fail and make him lose control on the spot. In addition, some deities who supported Klein on the surface might turn to help Aemon due to reasons he wasn't aware of. As for the sealed artifacts that could change the power balance between the deities, Klein didn't know much about them and wasn't able to make an analysis. Hey, I didn't expect that there would be a day when I fleeced the Mother Tree of Desire. Yes, I have to make some preparations for the worst-case scenario to prevent things from developing in this direction. Klein dispersed the paper and fountain pen in front of him and cast his gaze at a particular prayer light. His figure vanished from Sephira Castle and appeared on Bernadette's dawn. Queen Mystic Bernadette seemed to have a sense of foreboding when she saw Gehrman Sparrow's arrival. Without any surprise, she put down the ancient scroll in her hand and cast her gaze at the visitor at the door. Klein didn't stand on ceremony and said directly, "I wish to borrow the magic wishing lamp for a day." Bernadette nodded gently and raised her hand to pick up the magic wishing lamp beside her. Her invisible servant immediately held the unique lamp and brought it to Klein. Klein took it and said in a deep voice, "Thank you." Bernadette didn't make any requests. It was as though she wasn't afraid that she would end up having accumulated an additional wish and dying a strange death. She believed that Mr. Fool would be able to resolve this problem because the existence had displayed this ability the last time. In the next second, Klein, who had transformed into Gehrman Sparrow, vanished from the dawn and returned to Sephira Castle. When he placed the magic wishing lamp on the table in front of him, he immediately saw the candlewick light up, emitting a sticky light that formed a distorted, blurry golden figure. "You haven't fulfilled your promise yet, so I won't fulfill your wishes according to your will again," Genie said with a majestic and dignified voice. "You should know that the current owner of this lamp is Roselle's daughter. The first wish you made was to place her accumulated wishes that could allow her to suffer a backlash at the level above the sequences on you. And this time, I won't permit you to transfer her wishes onto yourself." When Klein had used the magic wishing lamp to escape, he hadn't changed the ownership of this Grade 0 sealed artifact. It still belonged to Bernadette, and its wielder was still Queen Mystic. Therefore, his wish would simultaneously be accumulated on himself and Bernadette. At that time, his first wish was to transfer the 2 wishes that Bernadette had previously made under his name. This cleared Bernadette's accumulated wishes, and he was burdened with 2 wishes. But at the same time, this first wish was also accumulated. Therefore, after it was fulfilled, Bernadette's count became 1, and Klein's was 3. Following that, Klein made a second wish. It would undoubtedly be counted towards both Bernadette and him. Finally, Bernadette's wish count was 2 without exceeding the critical point, while Klein reached 4. Without any surprises, he encountered the backlash from the rules that were at the level of an outer deity. He died on the spot in Adam's Corpse Cathedral and successfully escaped. Under the premise that Klein made another wish, it would make Bernadette's wish count reach 3, causing her to unavoidably suffer something terrifying. Of course, he could also mimic the first wish he did previously, transferring Bernadette's wish count onto himself and spending 1 chance at revival. However, the genie had already made it clear that he would distort any similar wishes, allowing the wish to be realized in a way that Klein didn't wish to see. "Sigh, it's also because I was in a rush the last time. And Roselle was affected by the primordial moon, so the wish we came up with was definitely flawed. At that time, I should have added a description to make the first wish only count under my name. Or perhaps, I should have added another wish between the first and second wish to transfer the ownership of the magic wishing lamp to me. After all, my death would result in the ownership being cleared, and the magic wishing lamp would return to its wielder. As Klein sighed inwardly, he smiled at Jeannie. You should be no stranger to tampering and reassembly. With your level and current state as this lamp, I can now rely on Sephira Castle to graft its ownership from Bernadette onto me. Or perhaps, we can use a different method and directly use theft. Jeannie's blurry golden figure fell silent. After a few seconds, he said, although you aren't as cunning as him, you're just as shameless. However, this is of no use. After you accumulate your wishes and die, the ownership of this lamp will still return to Roselle's daughter. And I will distort the rules and place your wish count onto her. Also, I said earlier that before you fulfill your promise, I won't fulfill your wish normally again. Klein maintained his smile. I once heard a story regarding investors. When a company is in trouble, the ones who are more willing to provide aid will definitely be the original investors. Although they have already paid a lot, if they don't continue investing, they might not be able to recoup their investment and end up losing all their money. Of course, if they could use other means to retrieve their own share, or exchange their investment for greater benefits, it would be another story. Which type do you think you are? Jeannie stared at Klein, who was sitting in the fool's seat, and laughed. After you gain a deeper grasp of Sephira Castle, you also seem to have obtained the eloquence of a swindler. However, unless you help me remove the seal now, it will be difficult for me to affect matters at the level of Sequence 0. At most, you will encounter a backlash from above the sequence's laws and die again. However, this won't be of any help to what you wish to do now. Death means failure. Furthermore, you should know very well that losing control during your advancement will affect all your avatars. It's not something that can be avoided by cutting off all connections. Klein smiled and nodded. Indeed, I haven't thought of a wish yet. I'm just making preparations. With that said, he looked at the magic wishing lamp. Actually, this lamp has another use that can affect matters at Sequence 0. I heard that a true god once attempted to destroy this lamp, but failed in the end. Indeed, how can a lamp that can seal an outer deity be so easily damaged? It definitely has the power of the Lord of the Mysteries or Sephira Castle. As he spoke, the smile on Klein's face gradually became obvious. It's such a waste not to use something as sturdy as this as a shield. Quote ellipsis quote. Jeannie fell silent for a long time. After such a friendly exchange, Klein and Jeannie exchanged their views. The fact that both of them were connected by fate had allowed them to come up with a preliminary agreement. Then, Klein placed the magic wishing lamp into his pocket, prepared to use it at any time. After completing all of this, he cast his gaze at the fragments of light related to the Hornachus mountain range in the fog of history. He was almost done with his preparations. Next, he would create another avatar and steal the undigested attendant of mysteries beyond a characteristic from himself. Then, he could face the ancestor of the Antigonus family. And this might very well trigger a divine battle. To be frank, Klein didn't wish for that to happen. This was because a war of deities would likely have a negative impact on the real world. Back when the Rose Redemption stopped the resurrection of the Primordial One, in the divine battle to assassinate the ancient sun god, which involved the help of Dark Angel Sasria, it directly brought about a disaster that affected the entire eastern continent. This caused more than 99% of the living creatures there to die, making large swaths of the terrain to resemble the abyss. The War of the Four Emperors and the Pale Disaster had nearly destroyed the northern continent, causing countless people to die and mutate. This caused the mountains to turn into lakes, valleys into peaks, rivers changing paths, the land to collapse, and the ocean to go berserk. The battle between the Evernite goddess and the god of combat happened in the astral world. It happened in the Evernite goddess's divine kingdom, and it was relatively brief. Therefore, it had the least impact on the real world. However, before that, the world war that exceeded a year had drained the blood and tears of countless people. If it was possible, Klein was actually willing to give up on Sephira Castle and live on as a Sequence 1 or even a Sequence 2 angel. The matter would then develop in the most peaceful way. However, along the way, there were already too many existences who provided him with kindness, help, and faith. At this moment, if Klein were to give up, he would put them into danger. This wasn't being kind, but selfish. From time immemorial, which successful person didn't bear the fates of many people? If he gave up, what about the rest? The members of the Tarot Club, the full believers of the City of Silver and Moon City, Azek Eggers, Rionet Tinica, Will Orcepton. Various faces quickly flashed across Klein's mind. Finally, he let out a long sigh. If Eamon could be trusted, it wasn't that Klein couldn't hand over all of this to him. However, this god of deceit had always been reckless. Even his believers were all himself. If Klein were to give up just like that, notwithstanding his own safety, the people or demigods he had just thought of might be caught by his enemies or directly end up wearing a monocle on their right eye. Among them, Will Orsepton and the fool's believers were in the most danger. Believe in the might of deities, but do not trust their benevolence. This was Klein's decision. When facing the Evernight goddess, he had used the Lord of Storms and company as an example. This was telling her that he wouldn't let her down after all the help she had given. This was the existence that had bet the most on him. If Klein were to give up, the Evernight goddess might have to pay a greater price to obtain the River of Eternal Darkness. She might even not be able to obtain it forever. This was because after the appearance of the two pillars, Lord of the Mysteries and God Almighty, it meant that the threat from the outer deities would be reduced to its lowest level. There wouldn't be any need for additional great old ones to appear. I'll later use Sephira Castle to graft the main peak of the Hornachus mountain range to the astral world. This can prevent the war of deities from bringing any harm to the real world to the greatest extent. It can also allow the deities who are guarding the cracking barrier to unleash their full strength. After all, most of my supporters are orthodox deities. Klein's mind raced as he came up with a solution. He then snapped his fingers and used Sephira Castle to create an avatar to stand beside him. The avatar Klein created was a blueprint of his present state, and not Dwayne Dante's, Sherlock Moriarty, or Merlin Hermes, so as to avoid any obstacles in his self-awareness. After experiencing the mutation brought by Adam, he became more careful in such aspects. Glancing at his avatar, Klein's thoughts made his face turn blank. The avatar extended its right hand and stirred Sephira Castle's strength to grab at the main body. Again and again, it failed more than 10 times. Finally, it managed to extract bits of dark light from the main body. Finally, Klein sighed and extinguished the thought of trying to execute this attempt during the actual battle. Despite not resisting at all, with his body and mind at ease, his avatar had still spent so much time failing while using Sephira Castle's level and strength. It was easy to imagine its value in actual combat. As more and more Beyonder characteristics left his body, Klein felt relaxed. He felt like he had finally abandoned a heavy burden after a long walk. Of course, there was a certain fluctuation in his mental state. After losing the lingering mental imprint from Zaratul, the awakening of the celestial worthy's consciousness began to invade his mind. This was within Klein's expectations, therefore, he wasn't flustered at all. With his self-awareness that had long stabilized, his tenacious willpower, and his ample anchors, he gradually resisted the corruption of the celestial worthy's will and found a new balance. At the same time, when the attendant of mysteries beyond a characteristic that Klein hadn't fully digested entered his avatar's body, its blank face suddenly twisted, growing out dark, lusterless eyes, and an indistinct white long beard. At this moment, it greatly resembled Zaratul. However, it was unable to withstand the madness brought about by the attendant of mysteries beyond a characteristic. Its body rapidly developed towards collapse as transparent, distorted maggots crawled out and slippery and sinister tentacles extended out. It lost control on the spot. Klein didn't stay idle. Without any hesitation, he moved his finger, making the avatar turn into his marionette. This terminated the process of losing control. At this point, he had already made all preparations. His main body had completely digested the potion, allowing him to be in a state to accommodate the fool's uniqueness. He also had a Sequence 1 marionette. Following that, Klein leaned back into his chair and replayed what he was about to do in his mind to see if there were any fatal flaws. This is the most I can do for the battle of the deities. I can only do my best afterwards. Am I being too optimistic about the first stage because of the goddess's help and the supplementary River of Eternal Darkness's water? That's why I'm not worried that the Antigonus family's ancestor won't cause any accidents. After a round of scrutiny, Klein felt that he was still not cautious enough. There was a little arrogance and carelessness in the matter. After some thought, he created another avatar which still had a blank face. After completing this, Klein stood up, took out Creeping Hunger from the Fog of History, and wore it on his left hand. This was a preparation for any possible small-scale battles. Under such a scene, Blink was faster and more convenient than grafting. After adjusting his collar, Klein slowly surveyed the area and made his gaze fall on the strange door of light that was stained with bluish-black. It landed on the humans who were hanging there, wrapped in transparent cocoons. As he scanned each and every one of them, his gaze landed on the 3 shattered transparent cocoons. In the next second, Klein's figure vanished and appeared in the grayish-white fog of history. He walked to the time before the first epoch, and he arrived at the stacked metropolis of old. He stood at the top of a dilapidated skyscraper that barely stood erect. He looked down at the pile of wreckage, the public transportation vehicles that had turned into metal pancakes, and numerous overlapping sedans. Amidst the silence, he swept his gaze across the remaining buildings. It seemed to pass through the barriers of history, allowing him to see the electric lamps lit up inside them. The light from the lamps spread out gently, illuminating the glass and skyscrapers, streets, and every corner of metropolis ruins. After staring at it for a long time, Klein retracted his gaze and took a step back to the real world. Right on the heels of that, he directly teleported to the summit of the Hornachus mountain range. He saw that ancient palace that was shrouded in fog, dilapidated, and overgrown with weeds. His marionette and avatar appeared in front of him, like 2 guards. Facing the ancient palace, Klein pressed his top hat, raised his right hand, and snapped his fingers. The peak of the Hornachus mountain range instantly turned dark. Illusory stars appeared around them. Klein had grafted this place to the astral world. Without any hesitation, he led his marionette and avatar to the main door of the ancient palace. The marionette that looked almost identical to him was 1 step ahead. It bent down, stretched out its hands, and slowly pushed the heavy stone door open. The door slowly creaked open, revealing the scene inside. And it was different from the last time Klein sent the Trunsoist brass book over. It was dark inside, making it impossible for anyone to see the numerous corpses hanging above the hall, nor could he see the cluster of transparent maggots that was sitting on the huge stone chair. Without needing to guess, Klein made use of the intuition of a seer at the King of Angels level to confirm that this was the change caused by the Evernite goddess using the river of eternal darkness's water to allow the ancestor of the Antigonus family to enter a state of eternal slumber. After the marionette and avatar entered, he slowly walked through the door and entered the palace. The darkness swayed and changed. Numerous buildings appeared in the surroundings as figures walked along the streets. Their voices spread out, causing the surroundings to become lively and noisy. The people ignored Klein and his marionette and avatar as they headed for the destinations while chatting with each other. They and the buildings were dark in color, almost close to black and white. They were like old photos that came from deep within history that had suddenly come to life. This made Klein think of black and white holographic projections, the scenes in the historical void, and those in real dreams. He strolled through this town and walked along the elevating streets. And the higher they went, the more magnificent the buildings became. The massive stone pillar supported an exaggerated dome. The people living in this black and white photo were generally tall. They seemed to be learning, working, and resting. The scenes here changed continuously, showing the birth of a baby, the growth of a child, the ignorance of youth, the worries of an adult, the pressure of a middle-aged man, and the sorrow of aging. Of course, they were all interlinked with each other. Only a portion would become the main theme at times. As Klein ventured deeper, he saw the residents of the towns die. Their loved ones weren't overly sad. They carried the dead back home, placed them on the bed with a pillow as if the corpses were still alive. When Klein was about to leave the town's borders, the dead got up from bed, left their family, and walked out of their homes, heading towards the highest point of the street. There was also a city there. It seemed to be the city of the dead, the eventual refuge of life, a kingdom of eternal repose. This was very close to where normal people lived. The latter was distributed by the mountainside to the peak, while the former was on the peak. Others might be surprised by such a state, but Klein instantly understood what this scenery meant. This was because he directly saw spirit-body threads on the deceased. The moment they were about to die, their spirit-body threads floated towards the peak, controlled by an unknown existence. That also meant that they had become marionettes. Therefore, the deceased could leave their own families and head to the peak after dying for some time. And this was completely in line with the details mentioned in the research of the Hornachus main peak's relics. The nation of the Evernite belonged to the Mother of the Sky from the Evernite pathway, but at the peak, there was a town used by the Antigonus family's ancestor. Therefore, the residents of the nation of the Evernite were respectful and afraid of Evernite. They believed in the Mother of the Sky. At the same time, they believed that death was not the end. They believed that the dead loved ones would bless them from Evernight. Indeed, death wasn't the end. The city of dead was just beside them, at the peak. They could reach it just by walking, and the dead would continue living their lives as marionettes. In the eyes of ordinary people, this was undoubtedly the same as still being alive. The nation of the living and the city of dead were like two ends of a road. The distance between life and death was so close that they were like neighbors. This also explained why the nation of the Evernight didn't have tombs, as the deceased didn't need to be buried. They turned into marionettes and headed for the peak. This should be the nation of the Evernight from back then. Klein nodded slightly and proceeded towards the peak in the dark environment. What entered his eyes was indeed a seemingly normal town, but everyone here was a marionette. After passing through the marionettes who dressed and looked different, Klein entered the magnificent palace that seemed to honor a deity. Deep in the palace, on the huge stone chair, a figure propped its elbow on the armrest, its head leaning back against the chair. His face was rather young, but his long hair was half white. Half of it was concealed, the other revealed. His appearance was that of a man, and his eyes were darker than Zarathul's, and they contained an indescribable sense of the vicissitudes of life. His facial features were pretty good, but his cheeks had a thick, black tuft of fur that resembled a wolf fur. He gave off a feeling of both old age and youthfulness, rationality and madness. This was the ancestor of the Antigonus family. This time, he didn't appear in the form of a mythical creature, and instead sat on a huge stone chair in his original appearance. At that moment, his eyes were tightly shut as though he was in a deep sleep. And inside the hall, there were corpses wearing simple or luxurious clothes hanging from the ceiling. They were like inverted forests that swayed gently in the wind. After entering a state of eternal slumber, the ancestor of the Antigonus family finally managed to temporarily free himself from the state of losing control and madness, and returned to how he was before. Klein stood in the middle of the hall, looking at his target as he sighed. The scene he saw of the nation of the Evernight and the city of dead earlier was the dream belonging to Antigonus, a dream that lasted for more than 1,000 years. Looking at the half-fool on the huge stone chair, the scenes from before, as well as the relevant scenes of the nation of the Evernight flashed through Klein's mind. This evoked thoughts in him. He didn't know much about Antigonus. In fact, he had almost lost control because of the ravings of his Hornachus Phlegraea. Therefore, he didn't feel any sympathy at the moment, at best some form of empathy. The lingering memories were undoubtedly one of the best memories of the past. Even though he was born extraordinary, Antigonus seemed to be deeply fond of the small, peaceful, and isolated nation. Klein slowly exhaled as he looked away from the man with the thick, black, sharp beard, and his gaze landed on the huge stone chair to the side. A book made of thin, yellow brass was quietly placed there. It kept having 3 mercury-colored lines of rules being superseded on it. 002, Trunsoist Brass Book. Using powers similar to grafting to complete the seal. Yes, it seems to have gone a step further. Not only is the beginning directly connected to the end, but the intelligence of the Trunsoist brass book has also been fooled, allowing it to ignore the middle parts that had been skipped, and not making attempts to change things. It just keeps repeating actions over and over again. Klein glanced at 002 and muttered to himself in thought. This made him have some guesses about the abilities of the fool. Without thinking further, Klein got the attendant of mysteries marionette to graft the starting point to the end point as he walked to the huge stone chair and picked up the Trunsoist brass book. On the one hand, this was to eliminate any possible interference, and on the other hand, he was trying to test out Antigonus's current condition. Seeing that the half-fool was still sleeping and unable to escape from his eternal slumber, Klein heaved a sigh of relief. He made his marionette take the Trunsoist brass book and retreat to the entrance of the palace to wait for him. The reason he didn't allow his avatar to retrieve the Grade 0 sealed artifact was that he was worried that the Trunsoist brass book, which had a certain connection with a Sephira, would be able to produce passive negative effects during the critical moment he was accommodating the fool's uniqueness. This might lead to the situation developing in a terrible direction. When it came to avoiding the negative effects of the sealed artifact, marionettes were definitely better than avatars. This was also why Klein didn't bring the Staff of the Stars. He couldn't place a time bomb beside him. Usually, it was fine. He could rely on his level, status, and abilities so as to forcefully suppress the Staff of the Stars, but in the process of accommodating the fool's uniqueness, he would be very weak. He couldn't interfere with the people or things around him. Any mistakes could cause him to lose control on the spot. To deal with the situation of Sephira Castle being sealed, thus causing him to be unable to use its powers, Klein had no choice but to bring a sealed artifact that could provide teleportation powers. Therefore, he chose Creeping Hunger. At that moment, Klein felt the glove on his left hand tremble while facing a king of angels that controlled a uniqueness. He then used his right hand to caress Creeping Hunger and whispered jokingly, "Don't worry. You're just a projection from the historical void." Using this method to ease his taut nerves, Klein surveyed the area and confirmed that there was nothing else he needed to do. Immediately after, he placed his hand on his chest and bowed deeply to Antigonus. When he straightened his body and lifted his head, a complicated, mysterious, illusory brand appeared on his forehead. This brand was like a strange door of light that was tainted with hints of bluish-black. It constantly emitted a faint grayish-white fog. In the next second, Klein reached out his right hand. Although it wasn't too far away, nor was it too close. He contained Antigonus's body within his fingers. His fingers quickly closed, and with a twist of his wrist, he completed the theft. He obtained nothing. This attempt failed. Klein wasn't depressed. He once again began stealing Antigonus's identity, fate, and self-awareness. Although he was already a king of angels, his powers in stealing came from Sephira Castle. At present, he was only at Sequence 1, while Antigonus had been corrupted by the Lord of the Mysteries, a king of angels that had accommodated the uniqueness. There was still an obvious difference between the two. Therefore, even if Antigonus had entered a temporary state of eternal slumber and was unable to resist, Klein suffered failure many times. He wasn't nervous or disappointed in such a situation. This was something he had expected previously. After all, as long as the theft wasn't completed, the Evernite goddess wouldn't dispel the concealment effect and let the fate here interact with the real world. There wouldn't be any external interference either. Klein had plenty of time and a stable environment to continue his attempts. After failing countless times, Klein suddenly had a flash of inspiration and predicted something. He reached out his right hand again, closed his fingers, and twisted them gently. Suddenly, he felt something invisible leave Antigonus's body and float towards him. At the same time, an indescribable river of light with countless distributaries appeared in front of him. The illusory river continued to flow forward, drowning one distributary after another, allowing them to become part of the main river. This was a symbol of fate. It also had many different images, such as a slowly rotating segmented wheel, or a giant serpent that had its head and tail connected. At that moment, when fate was swapped, Klein saw the river of light. In the next second, fragmented images and scenes appeared in Klein's mind. An 8-legged demonic wolf, who had just been born, was sprawled on the hill. Amidst the thick and black short fur on its body, transparent and distorted maggots crawled about. He was the youngest son of the ancient god, Phlegrea, a natural mythical creature. At that moment, he was looking at his sister, brother, and a portion of his clansmen playing amongst corpses. He despised the crude methods they employed when dealing with their prey. He believed that prey should be hoisted up for slow, refined enjoyment to match their status. This demonic wolf that could be called a subsidiary god was most afraid of his father, the powerful, terrifying, crazy ancient god. Although Phlegrea had already produced many children through instinctual mating, removing plenty of his beyonder characteristics, it was uncontrollable with no way to guarantee progress. Therefore, he was still crazy, cruel, bloodthirsty, and filled with an instinct for destruction. He had even killed several descendants. This demonic wolf who could create miracles and fulfill all kinds of wishes chased after his prey, biting or killing him, thus enjoying a state of pure happiness. He didn't have a deep impression of the subsidiary gods of his father, Phlegrea. He clearly remembered that he hated the god of wishes, Kotar. Even if he was also a demonic wolf. Also, he didn't like the god of death, Salinger. He found him gloomy, solitary, and that he exuded a rotting and disgusting aura. On the other hand, goddess of misfortune, Ammonizes, met the beauty standards of both a demonic wolf and a human. She had a gentle personality and was very good at placating one's heart. She wasn't annoying, but this female subsidiary goddess rarely appeared. She was always like a shadow, hiding in a place that wasn't easily discovered. Of course, the demonic wolf remembered that a few of his older sisters and brothers were rather against Ammonizes, hoping to seize her position. The demonic wolf witnessed his father's death, the death of a powerful ancient god, and saw the blood of the ancient god splattered all over the body of the goddess of misfortune, Ammonises. And in the chaos, the uniqueness and a sequence one beyond a characteristic were pulled into her hands. He and one of his sisters escaped the kingdom of the demonic wolves and hid everywhere. Without the protection of his father, the demonic wolf and his sister realized that their former reckless life wasn't normal. Pain and danger were present in everything. Finally, they crossed the sea and came to the northern continent. They established a concealed kingdom in the uninhabited Hornachus mountain range. He and his sister didn't dare expose themselves. All they did was gather believers and amass a population. In this situation, he created the city of dead that existed alongside a living nation, making the dead believers become his marionettes to complete an advancement ritual. Although this period was filled with anxiety, it was the best time period in the memories of this demonic wolf. As he saw his sister having more and more believers, and how his marionette town was becoming more complete, he seemed to have forgotten the troubles and dangers of the outside world and achieved the first peaceful time period since his birth. Under the influence of the believers, he and his sister gradually gained some so-called humanity. After the cataclysm, he finally advanced to Attendant of Mysteries and turned himself into a human. With the last name of Antigonus, he left the Hornachus mountain range and returned to the real world outside the concealed kingdom. From this moment onwards, Antigonus's memories and knowledge became increasingly fragmented. Many times, he even found himself a little unfamiliar. After he accommodated the fool's uniqueness, the situation became worse. As the images flashed, Klein quickly came to a realization. I am Antigonus, I am the half-fool. With a loud boom, his body constantly changed. At times, he had black hair, brown eyes, and a scholarly air, a Klein Moretti who had fused with Joe Mingrui's appearance. Occasionally, he had long white hair and a thick black beard like Antigonus. Other times, he wore a dark black cloak that made it difficult to see his face, and this mysterious person constantly extended slippery tentacles to the side. At that moment, Klein's thoughts were extremely chaotic. His mental state was completely imbalanced. He was barely able to maintain his self-awareness. Under the impact of the two mental storms, he teetered. At the same time, he had received the fate of Antigonus's losing control and was on the verge of collapse. A series of prayers rang out in his ears. Each and every word of praise was mixed together, forming an illusory image that joined the chaotic battlefield. Rorstad Archipelago, Biam, the bell tower of the Church of the Fool. A young man wearing a pointed hat and monocle suddenly appeared here and stood behind the railing, looking down at the entire city. Mr. Era Amen. In the next second, he saw Biam and the distant new city of Silver and New Moon City disappear as though someone had wiped them off the map with an eraser. How boring. Upon seeing this scene, Amen shook his head with a smile. He wasn't disappointed either. He only wanted to test if Klein or the Evernite goddess had repaired the bug in this aspect. After striking the bell, he could be considered the fool's angel of time to a certain extent. He could use this loophole to directly steal a portion of his anchors. Such theft was of little value, but it was very useful at the critical moment of a ritual. The sudden decrease in anchors would definitely tip the balance, causing Klein to lose control on the spot. Amen then retracted his gaze and raised his hand to straighten the monocle on his right eye. It was as if the light from the stars suddenly lit up in the crystal monocle. Thud, thud. The doors of Backland, Trier, Lemberg, and St. Millem opened and closed at the same time without a breeze. Inside a white tower in the headquarters of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom. Luca, who was on duty underground, sensed that something was amiss and stood up abruptly. As a prophet, he acutely sensed that something was happening. The elder in a brass-threaded, white robe immediately used a mystical technique and arrived at the entrance of the underground area. He pushed the door open. However, the door that wasn't considered heavy to a demigod didn't budge as though it was sealed by an invisible force. Luca Brewster didn't attempt to forcibly open it as he cast his gaze deep underground. There was silence. There was no sound. This isn't normal. Luca didn't need to rely on his Beyonder powers to determine the problem here. Usually, in the deepest part of the ground, there would always be sounds that made people's hair stand on end. But now, it was as if it had disappeared, as though it never existed. Others might not know, but as a high-ranking member of the Church of Knowledge, Luca knew that the voice came from an extremely terrifying sealed artifact that even he didn't know the exact details of, so it was impossible for it to be erased out of thin air. The current situation could only mean one thing: either the sealed artifact had already escaped the restrictions and entered a more bizarre state, or it had been sealed further, preventing it from affecting the outside world. Regardless of the possibility, it meant that there was extreme danger lurking in the surroundings. This was because the sealed artifact's number was 001. At the top of Biam's remaining bell tower, the light on Amon's monocle gradually faded, returning to normal. Mr. Error hadn't held back from showcasing his new Beyonder powers, doing so to make a statement to all the existences watching him. He had already accommodated Door's uniqueness and obtained the corresponding authority. He had used this opportunity to shut off everything related to the concept of a door in the entire world, greatly strengthening the effects of any seals. This caused the Orthodox churches and secret organizations to be unable to use sealed items for a short period of time because no one could remove the seal. Even if a true deity descended from the astral world, it would still take them a certain amount of time before they could break the restrictions. Therefore, Amon eliminated most Grade 0 sealed artifacts in the subsequent Battle of Gods. He no longer needed to consider the corresponding interference. Read latest chapters at wusharworld.eu. Of course, such authority wouldn't be able to influence the entire world for too long unless Mr. Error had put all his energy into this matter. It was precisely because of this that he didn't do it ahead of time. Only when he observed the disturbance in Klein's anchors did he suddenly act. The more powerful a Grade 0 sealed artifact was, the more terrifying the negative effects would be. It was even more so for those that could produce effects at the level of a deity. Even a Sequence 0 true deity might not be able to withstand it for too long. Therefore, true deities wouldn't unseal them unless it was necessary, otherwise, this would bring about an even greater disturbance to them, causing them to suffer a net loss. After doing this, Amon held up his palm and gently leaped up. Without the bearing of a true god, he sat on the railing at the top of the bell tower. As he gazed at the horizon out into the sea, he leisurely waited for the concealment to be removed. That was when Klein's ritual to accommodate the fool's uniqueness officially began. When that happened, he would strike the death knell for him. In the concealed world of the Evernite goddess, under the repeated impact of the awakening of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings, and Antigonus's self-awareness and mental imprint, Klein's consciousness was like a sailboat in a storm. It would sometimes be thrown high while being struck down. At times, it would suffer corrosion, and at other times be slammed to the side. This made his thoughts turn extremely chaotic. He was about to split into two different personalities, known as Antigonus, and the Lord of the Mysteries. At the same time, his avatar also lost its rationality. It was in a state of being about to collapse into a whirlpool of maggots. Only the marionette remained standing there in a daze due to the lack of any control. The prayers from the believers resounded in Klein's ears, forming a corresponding image of what he knew. This was like a dam that was resisting a surging flood. Klein wasn't too unfamiliar with such a situation. He had a similar experience after becoming an attendant of mysteries and swallowing Zarathul's Beyonder characteristic. Therefore, with the help of his anchors, he managed to survive the initial chaos. With great familiarity, he directed the self-awareness and mental imprint of Antigonus towards the awakening will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. This caused both parties to corrode each other and be occupied with each other. The mind storm weakened a lot, finally giving Klein's self-consciousness a breather. Before he could calm down, he immediately directed the image of him as a god formed by many anchors, into the two mental corruption struggle and tried to find a new balance. However, this didn't go smoothly. Compared to before, the essence of Antigonus's mental imprint, resilience, and madness were clearly stronger than Zarathul's. After all, this was a king of angels that had accommodated the uniqueness and was known as the half-full. Furthermore, Klein had also stolen the other party's identity and fate. This brought about two other negative effects. His personality was constantly on the edge of dissociating. From time to time, he would think that he was Antigonus, attempting to fuse his mental imprint with his own mind. Having accepted the fate of Antigonus's loss of control, his entire body was collapsing uncontrollably. This brought about even more mental corruption. In addition, Antigonus's mental imprint and the awakened will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings wasn't completely incompatible. In some aspects of the battle, they showed signs of fusing together. It was as if they originated from the same existence. This gave Klein preliminary confirmation. As a natural mythical creature, Antigonus was born with some of the celestial worthy's will. When he advanced to attendant of mysteries, the problem suddenly became serious, causing him to undergo unexpected changes without him realizing it. By the time he managed to accommodate the fool's uniqueness, madness had apparently become another side of him. In other words, before completely losing control, Antigonus was already a mentally sutured monster to a certain level. His self-awareness and mental imprint were part of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings, and this was something that couldn't be separated by using theft. Compared to him, Zarathul's mental imprint was much cleaner. There was only a small portion that belonged to the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. Most of it came from Zarathul's intense emotions at his deathbed. The reason why the two were different was that, apart from the fact that Antigonus had accommodated the fool's uniqueness, the former had become the attendant of mysteries at the beginning of the fourth epoch. At that time, the will of the celestial worthy hadn't weakened to the state it was in during the late fifth epoch. Without being able to form a new balance, the speed of Klein's breakdown became faster and faster. More than half of his body was formed from transparent and distorted maggots, and he extended slippery and sinister tentacles into his surroundings. Just as he was trying his best to maintain his consciousness and not give up searching for a new balance, his collapsed body, Antigonus's crazy mental state, and the consciousness of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings all fell into a deep sleep. This caused all the changes to stop abruptly and return to normal. As for Klein's self-consciousness, he used his trait of resisting dreams and the invasion of his mind to maintain his clarity of mind. That's right. The fate that I stole includes the fate of being in a state of eternal slumber outside the fate of going crazy and losing control. As for me, I can resist eternal slumber to a certain extent. Klein grabbed the sliver of clarity and gained a certain understanding of his present state. To him, this was an opportunity. It was only at this moment that he fully understood why the Evernite goddess needed the river water of the river of eternal darkness to use as a medium to attempt this. This wasn't only because it was difficult to put a king of angels who had accommodated the uniqueness, and the awakening will of the Lord of the Mysteries in him, to temporarily enter a state of eternal sleep, but it was beneficial to Klein for this state of eternal slumber. This could create an excellent environment of him being the only one with a sliver of consciousness while the other interference was all sleeping. At the same time, Klein also confirmed one thing: the reason why he was able to remain clear-headed in a dream and during the instances where his mind was intruded wasn't because of the special traits from Sephira Castle. This was because the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings in his body was also sleeping. Although the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries was still greatly limited, his level and his connection with Sephira Castle were undoubtedly stronger than Klein's. If he couldn't completely resist a state of eternal slumber, why could Klein? Therefore, Klein believed that this trait was likely due to the blessings of the Evernite goddess, a gift he received when he came to life. The blessings given by a true goddess who wielded the power of the dream domain, and the aura, strength, and magical powers that Sephira Castle augmented him with had combined together to form such a special trait. It was as if a gentle song came from deep within the dream. Klein's consciousness became clearer. Without any hesitation, he immediately adjusted the sleeping imprint and corruption in his body and found a new balance. Following that, he extended slippery tentacles with strange patterns and used Sephira Castle's powers to steal the fool's uniqueness inside Antigonus's body. Perhaps it was because he was now Antigonus, the theft this time was successful after a small number of failures. A translucent mask with the symbol of the fool flew out from Antigonus's body. The man with the thick black beard was still sleeping, as though he would sleep forever. At the same time, the fog dissipated and illusory starlight shone into the hall. This ancient palace suddenly appeared in the dark and mysterious astral world, appearing at the peak of the Hornachus mountain range. The concealment had been removed, and fate began to be exchanged. At this moment in the forsaken land of the gods, on one of the mountain peaks, a shadow-like curtain appeared on the surface of a huge cross. It cracked open and a man walked out from it. He was Adam, dressed in a simple white robe with a thick blonde beard. Behind him was a thick shadow with 5 heads. This shadow had partially merged with him, but it hadn't completely become one. Adam raised his head and looked at the astral world which had been distorted from authority and symbolism. He smiled calmly and said to the shadow behind him, "They don't seem to be aware of the reason why I used visionary as the foundation this time. I've never told anyone about the results of this research. Just as he said that, he proclaimed in a solemn and deep voice, I am one, and also infinity, the beginning and the end." His eyes suddenly turned illusory as an ocean that seemed to contain all possible colors that appeared around him. Adam then raised his hand and grabbed the silver cross pendant hanging in front of his chest. A burning but illusory sun suddenly appeared above his head. To his left, lightning, squalls, and waves formed a supercilious phantom. On his right, there was a white tower with numerous brass eyes. The authorities and symbols that Adam had envisioned entered his body one after another under the influence of the Chaos Sea. Finally, the shadow that clung tightly to Adam's back shrank into his body. Suddenly, the sea that contained all the colors began to rise. Adam expanded into a giant shadow that seemed capable of holding up the world. The shadow slowly walked on the water surface of the illusory, chaotic darkness. It pointed at the astral world and solemnly declared, "Let there be light." In a blink of an eye, the entire astral world lit up. There were no other secrets that could be concealed. Even portions of the astral world that connected to Earth, the entire astral world, and the invisible barrier that had been separated from the universe appeared. At that moment, giant, indescribable faces seemed to cling to the transparent, cracked barrier, silently watching the developments inside. Inside the astral world, which was even more abstract than the spirit world, looking as though all the authorities and symbolism in the universe were included inside every object appeared. And the light that illuminated this area wasn't spread uniformly. It was mainly concentrated in a few places, stacking together, forming spots created by a prism. There were a total of 3 spots in such a state, each sealing the various illusory kingdoms. One of the kingdoms was covered in bright flowers in perpetual daylight. Another seemed to be formed from books that were opened or closed. Different figures shuttled between them as they read as a form of entertainment. One was covered in storms as lightning and thunder continued without end in the boundless ocean. In the next second, the 3 different kingdoms underwent a violent change. In the area with perpetual daylight, all the flowers emitted light, as if they had become burning, miniature suns. The countless miniature suns intertwined together and surged deep into the kingdom before rising into an abnormally blinding golden sun. It emitted a scorching light that could illuminate the entire world, an entire solar system. However, no matter how much energy was released by this almost real sun, or how many flares of super high temperature flames it created, it was unable to break through the prism-like spots of light. Every destroyed layer had a new layer produced at an equal speed. In another part of the astral world, on the surface of the mysterious country formed from all kinds of books, bits of brass points of light rapidly circulated on the spot of light, forming mysterious symbols that seemed to be searching for a critical point or effective method to destroy the barrier. During this process, the faint light formed a pair of illusory eyes that directly saw the weak spots and created eyes there. Meanwhile, inside the spot of light, there was also faint light swirling in it. It repeatedly took form, changing the critical points of the structure. This made it seem as though both sides were in a contest of the calculative abilities, with neither side clinching victory. In the boundless sea that was enveloped by lightning, wind, and rain, the spot of light suddenly lit up. It brought a portion of matter and approached the limit to speed, creating a violent wave that could destroy a planet. Such a wave, and the tiny bits of light constantly struck the prism-like spot of light, turning it into countless falling specks of light. At some point in time, the spot of light began to ripple like an illusory ocean that seemed to contain all colors. It seemed to solidify the surrounding environment, causing the light spots that carried the storm to slow down uncontrollably. Then, the points of light repeated a state of acceleration and deceleration. This kept repeating, but they refused to give up. With the Chaos Sea as a source, Adam used himself, and the true creator as a pillar, envisioned 3 uniquenesses, and accommodated them into this system. Adam seemed to exceed the limitations of above the sequences and became half a great old one. He was able to forcefully suppress the eternal blazing sun, the Lord of Storms, and the God of Knowledge and Wisdom by himself, trapping the 3 sequence-o true gods within their respective divine kingdoms. At that moment, he seemed to return to his peak condition, becoming that ancient sun god who slew one ancient god after another. He chose the two pathways of Visionary and the Hanged Man as his foundation for his resurrection because, apart from them having the trait of resurrecting, this was also the result of his research. This had the highest chance of becoming God Almighty. After using either one of the two pathways of Visionary and the Hanged Man to become a true god and gaining initial control over the Chaos Sea, he could take back the remaining uniquenesses and sequence one beyond the characteristics. This was the easiest path to advance to the Lord of the Astral World. And in this matter, there was something more special about Visionary than the Hanged Man. When the Visionary first gained control of the Chaos Sea and accommodated a second uniqueness and corresponding sequence one beyond a characteristic to a certain extent, he could envision the remaining fake symbolism and authority, allowing him to briefly obtain strength that transcended the sequences, giving him half a Great Old One's strength. However, at the end of the Third Epoch, the ancient sun god's plan was, after being assassinated, he would immediately revive in the Giant King's court where Sasria was. He would first take back the Hanged Man's uniqueness and three sequence one beyond the characteristics and became a sequence O true god. Then, with the first blasphemy slate placed beside him, he would gain preliminary control over the Chaos Sea. With this foundation, he would allow Angel of Imagination Adam to awaken and return to his main body to form a support. After building such a system, the ancient sun god would make use of the Hanged Man's grazing ability and a Visionary's virtual persona means to control the uniquenesses and sequence one beyond the characteristics of the sun, reader, and sailor pathways to allow himself to become infinitely close to a Great Old One and to maintain a minimum level of stability. He didn't directly accommodate the Chaos Sea and the other three pathways uniqueness and sequence one beyond the characteristics, because he didn't want to advance to become a Great Old One, a pillar, in that era. That would inevitably lead to the resurrection of God Almighty, causing him to lose himself. He planned on controlling the situation and materials. When the apocalypse approached, he would finish the last few steps and become a pillar with self-consciousness. And back then, he didn't plan on using Visionary as a foundation because he hadn't obtained the Quill of Alzod. He lacked the main ingredient. When the kings of angels betrayed him, and the plan failed miserably, he decided to take advantage of the disaster to take the best path when he was revived in Adam. At this moment, Adam, who had transformed into a giant shadow, stood on the water surface of the illusory, chaotic darkness, reflecting the astral world into his eyes, making it difficult for the three true gods to break through the restrictions. Surrounding him were beams of light that constantly fell from high above with blazing tails, illuminating the entire forsaken land of the gods, making both the northern and southern continents experience midday conditions simultaneously. In Biam's remaining bell tower, Aemon, who was sitting on the railing, nudged the crystal monocle. With both hands propped up, he suddenly leaped up and entered the astral world. During this process, his left hand had an ancient mottled stone slab appear at some point in time. The first blasphemy slate. Aemon had once used it to seal the gap caused by Mr. Dawes' returning ritual, to prevent the invasion of the mother goddess of depravity. After the return ritual ended, and the door of flesh and blood completely collapsed without a tunnel to maintain anymore, he retrieved the blasphemy slate. At that moment, Aemon casually threw the ancient, mottled stone slate down from the astral world and allowed it to land somewhere in the fog sea. It was a mountain that tore out of the boundless black fog. There was no end to its depth. Its surroundings appeared like a continent. After the first blasphemy slate landed, it accurately stabbed into the peak of the mountain, forming an illusory sea that contained all the colors. At the same time, Aemon entered the astral world and saw the main peak of the Hornachus mountain range that had been grafted here. He saw the ancient and dilapidated palace on the mountain peak. Wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe, his body rapidly expanded, instantly reaching the scale of a mountain. He opened his mouth, as though he was about to swallow Antigonus's magnificent but dilapidated palace. Suddenly, he saw a blurry figure. This figure was wearing a long, layered black dress that was not complicated but had countless stars speckled on it. She was as big as the current Aemon. A pair of huge arms covered in dark black short hair grew out from both her torso and waist, but there was a beautiful and gentle face that was covered in thin black gauze. Her eyes seemed to compress the starry night sky. It made one feel at peace, but it also made one feel an uncontrollable fear. One of her two hands held a huge scythe, and another pair held a bird-shaped, golden accessory. The remaining pair held nothing, as though she was holding an invisible object. Evernite goddess. In the next second, Aemon, who was wearing a monocle on his right eye, was quickly wiped away by an eraser-like, was a sketch. The Evernite goddess raised her two empty arms as she held up an almost invisible fog. On the surface of the fog, multiple doors of different shapes rapidly opened in different spots, but they were instantly blocked, preventing any loopholes from taking place. The Evernite goddess floated above the peak of the Hornachus mountain range in the astral world as she focused on controlling the fog world in her hand, preventing Aemon's true body from escaping. As more and more doors appeared, the opening of doors became faster and faster. This goddess was unable to deal with it alone. All she could do was raise her other two arms and raise the huge scythe. The dark black scythe rapidly turned into a corporeal coffin made of black fog. The almost invisible fog world was stuffed into the coffin, and all the movements instantly ceased. It was as though death had occurred. However, this silence only lasted for a second. On the surface of the black fog-formed coffin, a series of doors took form and opened again. As the Evernite goddess sealed the doors, she raised her arm that held a bird-shaped, golden accessory. The orange glow of twilight fell, adding a sense of decay and extinction to the heavy black coffin. The formation and opening of the doors slowed down as both parties entered a tug-of-war. At that moment, at the foot of the Evernite goddess, the main peak of the Hornachus mountain range collapsed. It was like the apocalypse had arrived early. At the same time, python-like black tentacles extended out from somewhere in the astral world. There was an eye at the end of each tentacle, either opened or closed. Any object that was seen by them would instantly turn into grayish-white rock. And anything touched by the tentacles distorted as limbs and heads stretched out, turning into good-looking women of all sizes. As the grayish-white spread rapidly, the tentacles surged towards the ancient and dilapidated palace, rushing towards Klein, who was about to accommodate the fool's uniqueness. Primordial demoness cheek. Countless demonesses of varying sizes brought with them the destruction of all matter, causing the scene of the entire Hornachus mountain range to develop in the direction of turning into a huge stone sphere. This made the dilapidated walls of the ancient palace collapse rapidly, exposing Klein, who was in the middle of the hall, along with his avatar and marionette out into the middle of the astral world. Just as the python-like black tentacles were about to rush into the palace, a crimson moon rose up like a scene from the apocalypse. In the perimeter of the hall that was bathed in moonlight, a cluster of wheat instantly grew out. There were flowers, mushrooms, and trees. They intertwined with each other, layer by layer, sealing the palace that belonged to Antigonus. At that moment, the hall where Klein was in seemed to be a ruin that had been sealed in history in a forest for thousands of years, as though it had been swallowed up by nature. The python-like black tentacles with eyes on their tips were blocked by plants growing wildly. They rose up as they constantly struck the screen that originated from nature, causing the latter to collapse or peel under layer after layer of petrification effects. However, no matter whether it was the wheat, flowers, mushrooms, trees, or newborns, they quickly returned to Earth Mother's embrace and grew again. Just like that, the barriers of nature were reborn and destroyed, layer by layer, as layer after layer was reborn. This showdown entered a stalemate. Earth Mother, who controlled the moon's uniqueness, fended off primordial demoness cheek. At this moment, a light that couldn't be seen by most beyonders landed from high above and crashed into the barrier of nature that used plants as a foundation. The light didn't have a physical body, as though it was formed from a flux of massive and miscellaneous information. In its illusory form, it tore through the gaps between the plants, like a torrent, heading straight for Klein, who was about to retrieve the translucent mask. Hidden Sage. At this moment, a blurry light shot out from the void, revealing picture-like projections around Klein. Some of them recorded the helplessness and misery humans felt when facing supernatural beings. Some of them used an epic-like brush to reenact the scenes of humans using their own bodies as experiments to attempt fusing with beyonder ingredients to obtain strength and save the race. Some described the unique cultures and traditions due to a black emperor, while others carried various viewpoints, books, and inventions. Some resembled the dawn of the present world, starting from the massive machinery that spewed steam, buildings that rose higher and higher, and clothes that made movement easier. The contents made the seemingly thin painting exude a heaviness. This was because they bore the inspiration and development of civilization, of human society at different stages. Back then, the god of craftsmanship didn't properly digest the Sequence 1 civilization Enlightener potion before advancing to Sequence O due to various reasons. He maintained his rationality and lucidity. However, this made him have to focus more on resisting the madness and inclination towards losing control. Amongst the 7 orthodox gods, he was slightly weaker than the other existences. The reason why the Church of Steam was the weakest orthodox organization was that, apart from having the shortest history and the least heritage, its corresponding god was also not in the best of conditions. By the time Roselle raised the Industrial Revolution as the son of Steam, a member of the Church, and brought with him all sorts of ideas, the god of craftsmanship took the opportunity to change his name to the god of steam and machinery, sharing in the progress of the enlightenment of civilization, and digested the corresponding potion. As a true god in a neighboring pathway, he eventually chose to stand on the orthodox deity's side after the hidden sage chose to be Klein's enemy. The terrifying flood of information crashed into the illusory pictures and rapidly expanded, attempting to crack the cage. However, the tens of thousands of years of civilizations were thick and vast. The history left behind by generations of humans that numbered hundreds of millions was so vast and magnificent. It was enough to contain the information flux of the hidden sage. When the hidden sage tried breaking through the limitations of the god of steam and machinery, in the hall of the Antigonus Hall that was sealed by layers of plants, Klein extended his slippery and strange tentacles to grab the translucent mask that represented the fool's uniqueness before moving it towards his face. Just as the mask covered Klein's face, numerous figures appeared around him. Some of them were men wearing postman uniforms. Some were ordinary birds, while others were microbes that couldn't be seen with the naked eye. There were hundreds or thousands of them. The hall that only had corpses hanging in the air suddenly became crowded. And the commonality of these figures was that they wore crystal monocles, or had a circular emblem of different colors in the same position. Amen. The avatars of Mr. Error Amen. It was unknown if they had used the primordial demonesses or the hidden sage's attacks to open a back door and use a loophole to secretly arrive near the target. Looking at Klein, who had just put on the translucent mask and was beginning to accommodate the fool's uniqueness, these Amens revealed a smile at the same time. They opened their mouths and said words that ordinary people wouldn't be capable of understanding. These words intertwined and formed terrifying and crazy ravings. You overlooked the primordial demoness. For her, Medici, who has only recovered to sequence 1, is no threat at all. Her greatest wish right now is to immediately produce a Lord of the Mysteries and open the seal of the Western continent, allowing her to have a chance of finding the City of Calamity. It's obvious that, compared to you, I'm the better choice. You're too weak. Hey, are you still waiting for the Mother Tree of Desire or the Mother Goddess of Depravity to provide you with help? It's useless. I placed the first blasphemy slate into the Fog Sea and placed it near the Abyss's entrance, not far from that primitive island. Also, the enhanced seal brought about by the corresponding authority of doors, and half of the Lord of the Astral World's control towards the world barrier prevents any outer deity from being able to have the powers penetrate inside for a short period. And without the influence of the outer deities, the dark side of the universe and the chained god currently do not wish to interfere in the battle of gods. They would rather seize this opportunity to escape their restraints. They also wish that a Lord of the Mysteries would be born as soon as possible to help them escape from the predicament. If it wasn't for the fact that stirring them would also trigger the outer deity corruption in them, I can promise you that I would have already reached an agreement with them to deal with you together. Amen was deliberately using real information to fill up the ravings, using this to make Klein suffer the effects of a two-pronged approach. One was the mental corruption brought about by the ravings, and the other was the corresponding content that distracted him. In any case, it wasn't a waste of time to him. On the one hand, he had sufficient avatars. Each worm of time saying one word was enough for him to form many words. On the other hand, he forcefully fused the information together, making a single word represent many things. At that instant, the ravings of Amen echoed in Klein's mind like sharp blades that pierced through his psyche, tearing through his mind. Normally, Klein could use his own status to suppress the ravings that were at most at the level of a sequence 1. It wouldn't affect him, but at this moment, he was accommodating the fool's uniqueness. His mental state was in a weak and subtle balance. Under such a scene, a straw might crush the camel's back, much less so many of Amen's avatars. Furthermore, while Klein felt a sharp pain in his psyche and his self-awareness was in a mess, the sleeping mental imprint of Antigonus and the will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings showed signs of awakening. In a sense, eternal slumber was an extreme seal. The Amens, who had accommodated Door's uniqueness, could undoubtedly be able to weaken the seal or even make it lose its effectiveness. Also, the translucent mask that Klein had just worn on his face, the Fool's uniqueness obtained an even stronger remnant will from the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. It was also gradually breaking free from the influence of eternal slumber, and it had a certain resonance effect with the same being in Klein's body. Without using any Beyonder powers, the Amens, who had simply created a few ravings, had thrown Klein into a state of imbalance, and he was on the brink of losing control. Furthermore, all of this seemed irreversible unless there was more river water from the river of eternal darkness that allowed Antigonus's mental imprint and the even more powerful will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings to continue sleeping. But at this moment, even if there was still the river water of the river of eternal darkness, the Evernite goddess wasn't able to divert her attention. This was because she was trying her best to suppress the dual pathway true God, Amen. From this point of view, the Amens were deliberately sacrificing their true body to stall the Evernite goddess, to create an opportunity for the avatars to destroy Klein's ritual. This was a little risky, but the result looked pretty good. At that moment, Klein's pocket lit up. The light was a pale golden color like sticky syrup. It instantly enveloped the surrounding area. Illuminated by this light included Klein and his avatar, as well as the book that was suddenly thrown over by the distant marionette. 002, Trunsoist Brass Book. The sealed artifact extended its body in midair. As it bathed in the pale golden light, a rule suddenly appeared on the blank page. It was completely different from the repeated laws from before. Speaking is prohibited here. Amen's avatars kept opening and closing their mouths, but they could no longer make a sound. A line appeared under the previous rule an instant later. Attacking each other is prohibited here. The Trunsoist brass book fell to the ground and spread open by Klein's feet. Under the illumination of the magic wishing lamp, it actually managed to break free from the repeated cycle from before, and it set up rules that were beneficial to Klein. With just a glance, the Amens made different responses. A portion of them adjusted their monocles, and together, they raised their right hands and gently clenched it, using the corresponding authority to strengthen the seal. On the Trunsoist brass book, a line of text before those rules gradually formed. All the following rules are ineffective. Another portion of Amens locked onto Klein, who was on the boundary of losing control. Not being able to attack him didn't mean that stealing and gifting were prohibited. On the different Amens' faces, the monocles in different forms emitted pure light. This was something they had stolen from the depths of the ruins of the Battle of Gods. It came from the ancient sun god's eternal daytime effect there. It could purify filthy and evil objects, and awaken sleeping creatures. They gifted this to Klein. This, combined with the ability to control the strength of seals obtained from the apprentice domain's authority, was enough to break the state of eternal slumber. In that instant, the mental imprint of Antigonus and the will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings in Klein's body awakened. The madness, the vastness, cruelty, bloodthirstiness, and coldness were like an invisible storm that wreaked havoc in Klein's mind. Almost at the same time, in the fool's uniqueness that he wore on his face without fully accommodating it, the powerful will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings seemed like a terrifying monster that had been sleeping in the darkness for thousands of years. It suddenly opened its eyes. The former chaos and loss of control swept over again at that instant, but Klein didn't panic. Following one of his contingency plans, he calmly used the grafting ability to guide the mental imprint of Antigonus to celestial worthies will in the fool's uniqueness, allowing the 2,000 years of entanglement between them to collide again. Meanwhile, Klein relied on his own consciousness and the anchors from the Fool and the Sea God believers to balance out the celestial worthies will contained within his Beyonder characteristic, just like when he separated out the attendant of mysteries marionette. If there weren't any accidents, and if this continued, there was a chance that Klein would be able to balance between the two sides and completely accommodate the Fool's uniqueness. He would enter the final stage of the ritual, but how could there be no accidents when he was surrounded by Amens? Several Amens strengthened the seal of the Trunsoist brass book and the magic wishing lamp to resist the former's rule limitations. Some Amens gave the eternal daytime to Klein, and a small number of Amens locked onto Klein and attempted a theft. They were trying to steal his lucidity. One Amen failed after another, but in the end, there was still a few Amens who succeeded. They stole away Klein's self-awareness for the next 2 seconds. Klein's thoughts blurred. Without his guidance, the Antigonus's mental imprint, the two wheels of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings, as well as the anchors from his believers instantly lost their balance and began to madly invade, influence, and corrupt each other. Everything became extremely chaotic, and it was as if it was developing irreversibly. Klein's body collapsed inch by inch, turning into clusters of transparent and distorted maggots as he extended even more slippery and sinister tentacles. And at this moment, the rules on the Trunsoist brass book were wiped away and began writing, "Speaking is prohibited here. Attacking each other is prohibited here." Soon after, a familiar text appeared before the two rules. All the following rules are ineffective. After the seal was strengthened, the Trunsoist brass book seemed to enter a new cycle. And the influence the genie exerted on it became rather limited. Klein's consciousness quickly regained lucidity, but the situation in his body was completely chaotic and out of control. This made him completely unable to deal with the different influences or have any hope of finding a new sense of balance. In other words, he would run down the path of losing control until he became a monster. Without any time to think, Klein initiated his final contingency plan using his instincts and experience. He instantly gave up on saving his body and no longer focused on this matter. Not only that, but Klein had also even allowed the Attendant of Mysteries marionette to turn into a whirlpool of maggots and let it fuse with his body along with Zarathul's mental imprint. He wanted to mess things up. However, Amon's avatars wouldn't allow him to make any attempts. Apart from the Amons, who were fighting against the magic wishing lamp and the Trunsoist brass book, the rest of them began to steal, once again, trying to throw Klein's thoughts into chaos again until he completely lost control. The Amon in the postman uniform succeeded, but what he stole wasn't Klein's lucidity, but a drop of fresh blood. This blood immediately seeped into Postman Amon's palm. Right on the heels of that, Postman Amon's eyes turned crimson as his stomach bulged at an unimaginable speed as it squirmed. He seemed to be pregnant with a child. He had stolen the blood blessed by the primordial moon, or in other words, the mother goddess of depravity. Klein no longer placed most of his consciousness on balancing the Antigonus's mental imprint, the awakening will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings, and his anchors. There was no need for him to endure it passively like before. He could barely respond to Amon's theft. He used grafting to change the target that Amon had stolen to Sephira Castle and tampered it to the junk pile, replacing it with the blessed blood of the primordial moon. This was from Shaman King Klarman. There was no doubt that there was a certain connection between Amon's avatars. Furthermore, it was impossible for their levels to reach sequence 0. Therefore, when the postman Amon was contaminated by that drop of blood, the other Amons also showed levels of chaos. Some of their stomachs protruded as well. Some of their eyes were dyed crimson, while others had invisible babies in their arms as they walked in circles on the spot. This caused the other theft to inevitably fail. Klein seized this opportunity and used the brief moment of lucidity to stir the power of Sephira Castle to cast a shadow over the ancient palace. This place was once again concealed. Then, he ignored the mental imprint of Antigonus in his body, Zarathul's mental imprint, and the two wheels of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings that was beginning to fuse together. He made the blank-faced avatar which stood nearby without having shown any breakdown to extend his hand towards his main body. Its 5 fingers quickly closed, and its wrist quickly twisted. As Klein's self-consciousness didn't resist and even took the initiative to cooperate, his avatar didn't suffer many failures before using the help from Sephira Castle to successfully steal his own consciousness, fate, anchors, and most of his identities. The only identity he left behind in his main body was his identity related to the Fool. At the same time, he had also stolen the identity, fate, and mental imprint of the Antigonus family's ancestor, the mark of fate and spirit. This could only succeed in a few tries thanks to his self-consciousness cooperating as the stream of light with countless distributaries appeared. Klein's avatar's face contorted as it turned into Klein Moretti, who had fused with Gehrman Sparrow's traits. He had become the main body without any beyonder characteristics. Of course, his self-consciousness and anchors were still resisting the mental imprint of the Antigonus family's ancestor, but compared to before, this was undoubtedly much easier to deal with. Having already adapted to the identity of Antigonus, he quickly found a new balance, delaying the fate of losing control. Although this remained unavoidable, it gave him a certain amount of time for his subsequent actions. On the other side, in the spot where Klein's original body was, there was only the Fool's uniqueness, all the Beyonder characteristics from the curtain, the Beyonder characteristics that originated from Zaratul, the tiny number of Beyonder characteristics which Klein had consumed and digested previously, as well as the awakening will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings, the remnant mental imprint of Zaratul, as well as the Fool's identity. And without Klein's self-consciousness, Antigonus's mental imprint, and the large number of anchors involved, Zaratul's remnant mental imprint was quickly destroyed and corroded by the awakening will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. In the next second, Klein's main body suddenly fell silent. The collapse of his body stopped. He lowered his head and stopped extending the slippery and sinister tentacles around him. He was so quiet that he appeared to have lost his soul. In such a scene, the silence was even more terrifying than madness. That frozen body seemed to be giving birth to an extremely terrifying monster. Klein didn't care about what was happening. He quickly grafted the partial connection between himself and his main body above the gray fog. Then, he shifted his target and locked onto Antigonus, who was on the huge stone chair. Without receiving Amon's help, the former half-fool failed to escape from his state of eternal slumber. Klein once again reached out his right hand, stealing the remaining Sequence 9 and 1 Beyonder characteristics of the other party. Although he was currently using the identity and fate of Antigonus, it was still difficult for him to complete the theft. Failure was inevitable. At that moment, outside the realm of mysteries created by Sephira Castle, Amon regained his consciousness from the initial chaos. They raised their hands and adjusted their monocles, causing the redness in their eyes to vanish. Others looked down at their stomachs and reached out to stroke them. A second later, the bulging stomachs split open, and baby after baby with faint crimson colors appeared. These infants didn't cry, nor were they deformed. All of them took out crystal monocles from the void in smooth succession and wore them to their right eye. The number of Amons increased. He had converted the babies which were due, turning them into his avatars so as to prevent the corruption of the primordial moon from interfering with him. At this moment, Earth Mother and God of Steam and Machinery had achieved the upper hand to some extent on their respective battlefields. They could finally make use of this small advantage to interfere with the situation inside the palace. Instantly, a portion of Amons turned into plants as they bloomed or bore fruit, returning to the land. A portion of Amons became knowledge, information, and words, as they ended up imprinted into an illusory book. However, there was still some Amons who had used blink, relied on loopholes, or from using the deception of the rules to successfully avoid the influence of the two true deities. As they continued to strengthen the seal of the magic wishing lamp and the Trunsoist brass book, they opened a door in Klein's realm of mysteries. At the same time, the angels also noticed the changes in the astral world, but the gazers were unable to penetrate the Earth Mother's natural barrier and the God of Steam and Machinery's civilization picture. They couldn't see the interior at all. This also meant that, even if they wanted to exert influence, there was nothing they could do. Inside the realm of mysteries created by Sephira Castle, Klein finally succeeded in stealing the Beyonder characteristics of Antigonus from Sequence 9 to Sequence 1, ones that had been digested. Due to the law of Beyonder characteristic convergence, the latter had attracted many Beyonders of the same pathway over a long span of history. While turning them into marionettes, he had also absorbed their Beyonder characteristics. Therefore, at that moment, there was still a large number of Seer pathway Beyonder characteristics left in Antigonus's body, including a miracle invoker Beyonder characteristic. The dark points of light quickly merged into Klein's body and fused with him. As he was now Antigonus, and as all the Beyonder characteristics had been digested by Antigonus, his fate of losing control didn't speed up as he maintained his previous progress. This way, Klein had once again become a Sequence 1 attendant of mysteries, one who had already digested the potion, with a fate that pointed towards losing control. At this moment, his original, main body, raised his head, his eyes dark. However, from this glance, the present Klein's mind instantly slowed down as his body turned cold. He almost had no way of resisting it. The powerful will that he was very familiar with began to slowly rise, attempting to influence Sephira Castle. The Lord of the Mysteries had awakened to a certain threshold in Klein's main body. The Fool had become a truly great existence that was being awakened. It matched the guess of the Tarot Club and was in conflict with true history. Before Klein's thoughts slowed down, he took the initiative to cooperate with Eamon and dispelled the realm of mysteries, allowing the situation inside to interact with the outside world. He had already fooled history without any problems, just like the first plan he came up with. As for how to end it, he never had a good idea. According to the changes in the situation, the final plan he activated at this critical moment was to not leave himself any way out. He would go from accommodating the fool's uniqueness to advancing to the true fool. In any case, this wouldn't be worse than the previous situation. The curtain that enveloped the Antigonus palace instantly vanished. An indescribable aura returned to reality, causing the entire astral world to shake. Outside the world barrier that was covered in cracks, the terrifying, indescribable faces suddenly changed. The invisible barrier began to tremble violently as if it would collapse at any moment. Every continent on the planet within experienced an earthquake. It wasn't a serious one, just rather obvious. Above the 5 seas, waves surged, as if they had encountered a sudden tidal force. Amid the noon sky, the crimson moon suddenly appeared. Its color became extremely saturated and expanded in an exaggerated manner. It was as if it had hung off the roofs of every house. Other than that, the brown planet, orange planet, scarlet planet, gold planet, and blue planet lit up at the same time, emitting light of different textures. If one looked down from the cosmos, the entire Earth appeared to be swept up by an invisible storm and trembled in place. This was a slight change brought about by the outer deities' attempt to break the barrier. The aura that floated inside the ancient palace in the astral world had made them collectively recall that terrifying existence. Agitated by this, either a result of rage or madness, all of them tried to stop his revival. Compared to them, who were blocked outside the real world, the first to react was the magic wishing lamp in the pocket of Klein's main body. The sticky pale golden light penetrated through the Eamon's enhanced seal, turning into a blurry and distorted figure. It stretched out its arm and pulled the Trunsoist brass book into its palm. The rules that were written previously had all disappeared, and a new article immediately formed: Resurrection of the deceased is prohibited here. A faint grayish-white fog flashed and a familiar text appeared in front of this rule: all the following rules are ineffective. Even though he hadn't really resurrected and had yet to absorb the Fool's uniqueness and 2 Sequence 9 to Sequence 1 seer pathway beyond a characteristics, the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings in Klein's main body could also control Sephira Castle and use its status to direct its powers. At this moment, his existence and the fog of history had completed their interactions. Fragments of light began to distort as they merged into one, sometimes breaking apart, unable to completely form a piece of history. A sense of self-conflict appeared in that piece of history. True history clearly involved the prehistoric human soul, Klein Moretti, disguising himself as the Fool and establishing the Tarot Club. He became stronger one sequence at a time, and eventually reached the level of the true Fool. However, the present history was that Mr. Fool was a great existence that was awakening, the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings from ancient times. He had finally awakened. At that moment, although the rule restriction put in effect by the genie using the Trunsoist brass book could only be effective for less than a second, it still significantly weakened the will of the Lord of the Mysteries inside Klein's main body, as though he had suffered a fatal blow. As for Earth Mother and God of Steam and Machinery, they had given up on interfering with Eamon's avatars, as though they wanted this Mr. Error to have the time to deal with the awakening Lord of the Mysteries. However, they, who clearly had some power to spare, didn't attempt to affect Klein's main body, but continued suppressing the primordial demoness and the hidden sage. The subsequent attacks and interferences from the latter two were no longer intense, as if they were waiting for an outcome. To them, the resurrection of the Lord of the Mysteries was the achieving of the goals, produce a pillar as quickly as possible, and prevent entities that had animosity towards them from becoming the Lord of the Mysteries. In addition, the pathways that they were in didn't belong to the 3 pathways that were controlled by the Lord of the Mysteries. Furthermore, they didn't have any feuds or conflicts of interest with the other party. Eamon, who was no longer affected, immediately changed his target and focused most of his attention on Klein's main body. There was no need for any explanation. They clearly knew that this was the greatest threat. Without any hesitation, the Eamons raised their right hands at the same time and gently squeezed it, seriously stealing the effects of the eternal daytime from the target. However, the Eamons didn't give up influencing Klein. With their numbers, they split off a small number of members and looked at Klein, who was currently a Sequence 1 attendant of mysteries. Furthermore, Klein also bore the identity of Antigonus. The monocles of these amens suddenly lit up. Using the authority related to doors, they moved Klein out of the real world and into the cosmos. In the dark and vast universe, Klein's figure appeared. Then, it instantly became thin, turning into a paper figurine. The paper figurine first had its belly bloated before giving birth to a paper baby. Then, it rapidly rotted into dust. Klein had used grafting and paper figurine substitutes to block the attacks of the amens. At the same time, the other amens had succeeded in stealing the effects of the eternal daytime from Klein's main body. However, in the next second, the effects of the eternal daytime were once again stolen back. This was the Lord of the Mysteries' control over powers from his pathway. Even though he had yet to fully revive, he had already begun this process. Amon's eyes flickered as he immediately gave up on Klein and focused on three matters. Most of them continued to steal the effects of the eternal daytime and resist the Lord of the Mysteries, while a small number of them locked onto Antigonus, who was sitting on the huge stone chair. They began to steal the other party's state of eternal slumber. In addition, all the amens had dispelled the strengthening of seals, and even weakened them. Klein, who was no longer being attacked by Amon, similarly didn't counterattack. His attention was focused on his main body. The awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries was the biggest problem. At that instant, an illusory mark appeared on Klein's glabella. It was a strange door of light that was stained with hints of bluish-black. It constantly emanated a faint grayish-white fog. Klein began to snatch control over Sephira Castle from the Lord of the Mysteries, so that it wouldn't be so easy for him to make use of the level and power. And with the Lord of the Mysteries not fully resurrected and having yet to accommodate the Fool's uniqueness and the corresponding Beyonder characteristics, he could effectively reduce his strength, allowing his failure rate to increase significantly and for the effects to be inferior. With his addition, with his control over Sephira Castle, the fooling received by the Trunsoist brass book immediately weakened. The chances of Amon's theft also increased. In the forsaken land of the gods, at the foot of the giant shadow formed by the ancient sun god, on the surface of the sea that was covered in all colors, words written in the most ancient language quickly appeared. The revival of the Lord of the Mysteries failed due to many interferences. With this sentence forming, as Klein fought for control over Sephira Castle, the amens once again stole the effects of the eternal daytime, effects that had augmented the Lord of the Mysteries. Elsewhere, they had also stolen Antigonus's state of eternal slumber. Without any hesitation, the amens transferred the state of eternal slumber to Klein's main body, and gifted it to the Lord of the Mysteries. The ancient existence's aura immediately fell silent, but it quickly rebounded. At this moment, the corresponding text appeared on the weakly sealed Trunsoist brass book: "Resurrection of the deceased is prohibited here." Suddenly, the terrifying will in Klein's main body rapidly weakened, producing a strong urge to fall asleep again. However, this will was so powerful that, even after a long period of time, it was unable to completely wear it down. Under these two restrictions, it was still tenacious and slowly recovering. It also attempted to use tampering and fooling to get out of the predicament. Klein sensed that the other party was using Sephira Castle's power, so he immediately focused and interfered. At the same time, the Evernite goddess, who was floating above the ancient palace, slightly relaxed her control over Amon's true body. She pulled back the bird-shaped, golden accessory and aimed its head downwards. Inside the bronze eye of the bird-shaped, golden accessory, illusory layers of doors surged out, allowing a drop of colorless water that had a strong aura of stillness to drop onto Klein's main body, in the ancient palace. This was a drop of river water from the river of eternal darkness. While the Evernite goddess was doing this, Amon's actual body's attempt to escape by opening doors also tacitly slowed down. The drop of water plummeted at an extremely fast speed. The natural barrier formed by Earth Mother, and the portrait formed by the god of steam and machinery simultaneously pulled back to give way for it. With a smack, the river water of the river of eternal darkness accurately dripped onto Klein's head and silently entered. The aura of the Lord of the Mysteries, which was slowly growing, immediately receded. It stopped its fluctuation and fell into a state of eternal slumber. However, this condition wasn't very stable, as if it could be broken at any moment. At this moment, the Evernite goddess's empty hand pulled out a gigantic sword from the void. The sword's surface was covered with orange-red light as it exuded the dawn of twilight, the aura of decay. This was the symbol of the Twilight Giant. The Evernite goddess's arm that was covered with short black fur extended, striking down with the exaggerated sword. She had always kept some energy as though prepared to deliver this moment. In the strange sound of the void shattering and decaying, the sword that was covered with the light of twilight slashed through the dome of the Antigonus palace, causing the hanging corpses to drop to the ground. Right on the heels of that, it struck Klein's main body, which had yet to escape the state of eternal slumber. The portion of the awakening of the Lord of the Mysteries rapidly vanished, and the body began to wane uncontrollably. It broke down along with the Fool's uniqueness and the two sets of Sequence 9-1 Beyonder characteristics in his body. They also collapsed and gathered together. Upon seeing this, Klein followed his plan without any thought. He used Sephira Castle to pull down a quarter of the fog of history and enveloped it. Amidst the grayish-white fog, the Fool's uniqueness and the Beyonder characteristics fully converged. They frantically absorbed the fog of history around them, turning into a shapeless and dark liquid. This blob of liquid stretched out as though it was forming a strange, translucent hooded cloak or a person whose internal organs and flesh were emptied out. The Fool's potion. The Amens reached out, their right hands at the same time in a bid to steal the potion. More than 1,000 Amens each committed theft. With his numbers, as long as he wasn't extremely unlucky, there would always be a few who would have succeeded. Furthermore, the Fool's potion was ownerless, so it wasn't difficult to steal. While carrying out the theft, Amen removed a particular seal on his body, allowing the apprentice and marauder Beyonder characteristics to release their powers of convergence. This was rather effective towards the Fool's potion, allowing Amen to increase his success rate to the greatest extent. However, all the Amens ultimately failed. This was because a new rule had appeared on the Trunsoist brassbook: acts of theft are prohibited here. In order to deal with the awakening Lord of the Mysteries, Amen had weakened all the seals here and helped the Trunsoist brassbook escape the fooling. It could now have a limited number of effective rules for a brief moment amidst its repeated cycles, but now, this had adversely affected them. Seizing this opportunity, the illusory brand between Klein's brows became more obvious. A faint grayish-white fog gathered around him, forming a thin cocoon. He activated Sephira Castle with all his might. Together with his attendant of mysteries beyond a characteristic, he created an extremely powerful convergence effect on the Fool's potion. The black liquid that didn't have a fixed form seemed to be a starving beast that saw food. It immediately pounced onto Klein. It kept extending and changing like a translucent skin, wrapping Klein inside. Klein's face appeared underneath this liquid. His facial features were sometimes distinct, sometimes blurred, sometimes distorted, and sometimes blank. In the forsaken land of the gods, under the giant shadow formed by the ancient sun god, words in the most ancient of languages rapidly took form on the illusory surface of the sea that contained all possible colors. Antigonus's efforts at advancing to the Fool ultimately failed due to various reasons. The reason why this existence that once dominated the entire planet didn't use Klein Moretti's name was that he was now carrying the identity and fate of Antigonus. If the subject in the sentence had been the former name, then Klein could completely ignore it. What had Klein Moretti's failed advancement got to do with Antigonus becoming the Fool? But when the subject became Antigonus, it was like a prophecy, as if it was an arrangement that had the outcome already be decided. Such a sentence could make the situation turn very grim. If Klein didn't give up on Antigonus's identity and fate, he would be restricted by those words. If he gave up Antigonus's identity and fate, then the Sequence 9-1 Beyonder characteristic in his body would no longer belong to him in the true sense of the word. He had never digested them before, they were Beyonder characteristics that Antigonus once controlled. At present, it had nothing to do with Klein Moretti. All he did was forcefully devour them. Under such circumstances, even if there were no other factors, just the undigested Beyonder characteristics would likely cause Klein to lose control on the spot. And consuming the Fool's potion in such a state and completing the advancement ritual was without a doubt impossible. As the ancient sun god wrote this sentence, the eternal blazing sun, the lord of storms, and the god of knowledge and wisdom, who was situated in the astral world, sensed something. Each of them launched the most intense of counterattacks in an attempt to interfere with the other party's actions. However, even though a large portion of his energy was spent restricting the three true deities, making it rather difficult, the ancient sun god quickly completed the sentence. However, his giant shadow embodiment dimmed, as though he was unable to maintain it for too long. In the astral world, within the floating ancient palace. In the battle that pit the Earth Mother and the god of steam and machinery against the primordial demoness and hidden sage, the situation became even more intense. However, the former two were still able to divert a certain amount of strength to affect Amon's avatar, preventing them from destroying Klein's advancement ritual. The Amons were forced to blink everywhere, but some of them still turned into plants, blooming and bearing fruit before returning to the land. Others collapsed into words as they were imprinted into illusory books. Apart from that, a large number of them were strengthening the seal, limiting the Trunsoist brass book, preventing the rules it enacted from being effective, or be effective for only an instant. Under the influence of these three factors, even with Amon's numbers, it appeared to be insufficient. But even so, a small number of them managed to seize the opportunity to make crystal monocles and similar circular symbols reflect Klein's figure. In the next second, the monocles and circular symbols emitted pure light. This wasn't theft, but the act of returning things. At this moment, Amon's decision was to return an item that he had formerly stolen from Klein. It was Klein's thoughts of suicide. Back when Klein was captured by Amon and brought to the forsaken land of the gods, he had tried on many occasions to commit suicide but failed to succeed. He had such thoughts, stolen by the other party. At the critical moment of his advancement, once he had the intention to commit suicide, the outcome could be imagined. At that moment, Klein, who was tightly enveloped by the Fool's Potion, felt his thoughts turn chaotic and wander. His hair spread out as he felt an extremely cold, sticky liquid slowly invade him. Then, he had the thought of committing suicide and giving up. This was a change that Klein had never expected. He had long forgotten how Amon had stolen his thoughts of committing suicide. Furthermore, he didn't expect that not only was the other party unwilling to abandon these thoughts, he had even kept them carefully. If it were any time in the past, this thought might have been strong, but Klein could still use his self-control to resist it forcefully, suppressing it until it dissipated on its own. It would be akin to dealing with nasty thoughts. But now, he was in the midst of an advancement ritual. He was being influenced by the potion, and his mind had lost its stability. He was unable to effectively suppress the thought of committing suicide. The Amons always had various strange but rather effective methods. Fortunately, Klein wasn't only Klein, but also Antigonus. What relation did Klein Moretti's thoughts of committing suicide have to do with Antigonus? With this level of knowledge from this additional identity, Klein didn't immediately give up and end his life. He pulled the Antigonus mental imprint in his body and mixed it with the idea of suicide, barely suppressing it. Under such a balance, Klein's mind and body were further corroded by the Fool's Potion. His thoughts were the same as when he advanced to Attendant of Mysteries, completely dispersed. But the difference was that he didn't fuse with the spirit world this time. Instead, he continued to extend, enveloping the entire planet, the entire spirit world, and part of the astral world like a gaseous body. At that moment, Klein felt that he was in the bodies of different believers, in every human's body, in every animal's body, in every living thing. Everything had godhood in them. At the same time, he was still scattered within the fog of history, scattered through fleeting time, and scattered inside the silent flow of a river of light with multiple distributaries. One was also infinity. At the level of godhood, an experience like this made Klein's thoughts wear away even further, as though all that was left was a coldness that looked down on everything. Even this coldness was dissipating slowly. It wouldn't be long before Klein completely lost himself and was led by the various mental seals in the Fool's Potion, becoming a true monster. This coincided with Antigonus's crazy fate, allowing the latter to accelerate. At this moment, he felt something off. It was unharmonious, unnatural, and abnormal. In the fog of history, there were a small number of light fragments twisting and distorting, unable to take form. It was as if there was a fundamental conflict between them. They gradually separated, breaking out into different branches to record the different content, allowing the twisting to achieve the initial state of recovering. Being imbued into everything, Klein's mind was thrown out, due to this tiny disharmonious abnormality. He found some aspect of self-awareness again. With this self-awareness as the core, he quickly gathered his scattered mind and guided the fusion process between the Fool's Potion and his body. But at this moment, the fate of Antigonus losing control thanks to the ancient sun gods' prophecy, erupted early. Klein's body collapsed once again, unable to withstand the Fool's Potion. Without any hesitation or having the luxury of time to hesitate, Klein immediately removed a portion of the theft effects and returned Antigonus his identity, fate, and self-awareness, allowing him, sitting on the huge stone chair, to slowly open his eyes. The dazed Antigonus gradually regained his clarity of mind. He didn't immediately lose control, because the main reason he lost control was that the Lord of the Mysteries as will had awakened to a large extent. And now, the Fool's uniqueness and most of the beyonder characteristics that contained a portion of the will was no longer in his body. Therefore, Antigonus could use his own will to resist the madness and try to stop the fate of losing control. The prophecy of the ancient sun god came true. Antigonus really failed to advance to sequence 0 the Fool. And without his identity, the sequence 9 and sequence 1 beyond a characteristic of the seer pathway in Klein's body turned into something that he hadn't digested. This threw him to the edge of losing control immediately. The Fool's potion that wrapped around his body like a cloak instantly completed the act of seeping through. The will of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings was awakened once again. Give up. Leave everything to me. This time, I won't accommodate another Sephira. I won't help you protect the living creatures you wish to protect, but I won't harm them either. It's not that I won't keep my promises, but it's just that they're too weak and not worth my attention. This place is an area that is off limits to outer deities. The unfamiliar yet weirdly familiar ravings reverberated in Klein's heart, giving him the idea of giving up. And the thought of committing suicide that he had been suppressed by Antigonus's mental imprint previously, surfaced again after the balance created by it was lost. The outcome of failing an advancement attempt was about to occur. At this moment, the Evernite goddess, who was originally powerless to slash downwards with the Twilight Sword, suddenly gave up on controlling Amon's true body. As Amon's true body leaped out, and just as the avatars waited for Klein to fail the ritual, the goddess once again dragged the exaggerated sword that was covered in orange light. This time, the target was Klein. A thought flashed through Klein's mind as he took the initiative to be controlled by the thought of committing suicide, not making any attempts to resist. With a poof, he was slashed by the symbolic sword of twilight, shattering into a rotten body of meat that seeped out beyond the characteristics. Klein died. Before the Amons took any sort of measures against him, he was killed by the Evernite goddess before the ritual failed and before he completely lost control. In the next second, the Evernite goddess wore the bird-shaped, golden accessory on her head as her body expanded and enveloped the ancient palace. She instantly erased Amon's true body, avatars, Earth Mother, primordial demoness, god of steam and machinery, hidden sage, and Antigonus, as though they were erased by an eraser. Concealment. The ancient sun god seemed to understand what the Evernite goddess wanted to do, but having already made 2 prophecies, there was no way for him to write a third sentence. As for the 3 true gods, they continued throwing what they had at him, holding him back. In the next second, a miracle happened. Klein returned from the fog of history. The uniqueness of the Fool that had already belonged to him and the 3 sequence 9 to sequence 1 beyonder characteristics rapidly returned to his body. Afraid that he would be disturbed, the genie quickly made use of the Trunsoist brass book to add a rule: this place is suitable for the return of beyonder characteristics. Suddenly, Klein returned to his previous state of him, drinking the Fool potion. But the thing that was different from before was that, back then, his body's pillar of support belonged to the sequence 9 to sequence 1 beyonder characteristics of Antigonus, ones he hadn't digested yet. And now, the first to return to him was undoubtedly the digested sequence 9 and 1 beyonder characteristic that once belonged to him. This way, he would have a true pillar of support that could accommodate the Fool's uniqueness and the remaining characteristics. Klein was in a state that was the same as when he first arrived at the main peak of the Hornachus mountain range, an attendant of mysteries who had finished digesting the potion and was capable of attempting to advance to sequence 0 the Fool. By relying on his resurrection, Klein had completely overturned his state. This was the flash of inspiration he had obtained from Roselle's resurrection. Of course, the entire process was different from the resurrection of a Black Emperor. The character that Klein had arranged to kill him was the genie. He never expected that the Evernite goddess, who he hadn't discussed this with, would share such tacit understanding with him. In that instant, his body split apart, turning into a thin gray fog and dark liquid. The gray fog and black liquid blended together, and the countless maggots that resembled meat tendrils sprouted on the surface. Then, they intertwined into a translucent dark-colored cloak. There was no body under the cloak, just darkness. This process was very brief. In less than 2 seconds, the Evernite goddess's concealment of so many deities was clearly unable to last that long. In an instant, a door of light traveled across the surface of the concealed world at an extremely high speed. The door suddenly opened, and Aemon, who was wearing a pointed hat and wearing a classic black robe, leaped out. At the same time, he saw an illusory mask with blank facial features appear under the translucent dark-colored cloak. The mask instantly outlined Klein, who had fused with Gehrman Sparrow's traits. Aemon's thoughts turned chaotic as though he had his intelligence forcefully lowered. The fool was born.